Chapter 1. The Pope's Bastard. The forensic team that examined the tomb of Pope Alexander VI in St. Peter's Basilica during the restoration of 2006 made a discovery that would reopen one of history's most controversial chapters about papal corruption and political manipulation. Hidden within a secret compartment of the Borgia Pope's sarcophagus, they found a collection of documents that had been sealed away for 5 centuries, letters, contracts, and detailed records that revealed the systematic use of his own daughter as a weapon in the most ruthless political campaign ever conducted from the throne of St. Peter. Among these papers was a marriage contract dated 1493, bearing the papal seal that sold 14-year-old Lucrezia Borgia to the highest bidder with the clinical precision of a military alliance. The inscription at the bottom, written in Alexander VI's own hand, read simply, "Let my daughter's womb secure what my armies cannot." The world was about to rediscover how the most sacred office in Christendom had been transformed into a brothel of political ambition, with the Pope's bastard daughter serving as both prize and weapon in wars fought not with swords, but with marriage beds and poison cups. To understand how Lucrezia Borgia became the most powerful and dangerous woman of the Renaissance, while remaining forever trapped by the circumstances of her birth, we must return to the spring of 1480, when her existence was already a scandal that threatened to destroy careers and topple governments before she had drawn her first breath. She was conceived in sin by a cardinal who would become pope, born into illegitimacy that should have condemned her to obscurity, yet destined to wield influence that would reshape the political landscape of Italy and challenge the very foundations of papal authority for generations to come. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, was a man whose appetites were as vast as his ambitions, whose understanding of Christian virtue was filtered through the lens of Spanish pragmatism and political necessity that recognized no distinction between sacred and profane when power was at stake. Already a cardinal of substantial influence within the college that would eventually elevate him to the papacy, Rodrigo had long since abandoned any pretense that clerical celibacy should constrain his pursuit of pleasure or limit his options for securing political alliances through the most intimate possible connections with influential Roman families. Her mother, Benozza Catanei, was no naive victim of clerical seduction, but a sophisticated woman whose beauty had been carefully cultivated as currency in the complex marketplace of Roman politics, where sexual relationships served as both entertainment and statecraft, where strategic liaisons could elevate entire families or destroy ancient bloodlines depending on their participants' skill in navigating the treacherous waters of papal court intrigue. Vanozza understood that her affair with Cardinal Borgia represented opportunity for advancement that could transform her from wealthy merchant's daughter into mother of princes, provided she proved capable of maintaining his interest while bearing children whose value extended beyond mere dynastic continuation into the realm of political assets whose strategic deployment could secure advantages that military conquest alone could never achieve. The pregnancy that would produce Lucrezia represented more than personal indulgence. It was calculated investment in future political possibilities that required careful management to maximize returns while minimizing risks to all participants, whose careers and lives depended on maintaining appropriate facades of respectability despite engaging in activities that directly contradicted their public positions and official obligations. The birth itself was managed with the kind of elaborate secrecy that characterized all Borgia family activities, involving multiple safe houses, carefully selected midwives whose loyalty had been secured through generous payments and subtle threats, and documentation procedures that could be modified or destroyed depending on future political requirements. But even as infant, Lucrezia represented complications that extended far beyond the personal embarrassment that illegitimate children typically created for clerical fathers, whose careers depended on maintaining at least superficial compliance with church doctrine regarding celibacy and moral behaviour. Her existence provided enemies of the Borgia family with potential ammunition for accusations of corruption that could be deployed at strategic moments to undermine Rodrigo's influence within the College of Cardinals or challenge his eligibility for higher offices within the church hierarchy. The solution that Rodrigo developed for managing these risks while maximizing the advantages that could be derived from his daughter's existence demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of both canon law and political manipulation that would eventually enable him to purchase the papal throne through systematic bribery and intimidation of electors whose own compromised positions made them vulnerable to pressure from someone who possessed detailed knowledge of their private activities and financial arrangements. Lucrezia's legitimacy was established through carefully forged documents that attributed her parentage to a respectable Roman nobleman whose cooperation had been secured through financial incentives and political favours that ensured his willingness to provide official paternity for a child whose real father's identity needed to remain concealed for reasons of ecclesiastical propriety. But this elaborate deception served purposes that went beyond merely protecting Rodrigo's reputation. It created a legal and social framework that would enable Lucrezia to be deployed as asset in political negotiations, while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of her relationship to Cardinal Borgia and his growing network of influence within the papal court. The fictional genealogy that was constructed for her background provided access to social circles and marriage possibilities that would have been impossible for acknowledged bastard of clerical father, while simultaneously creating opportunities for strategic revelation of her true parentage when such disclosure could serve Borgia family interests. The childhood that Lucrezia experienced within this web of deception and political calculation was characterized by luxury and privilege that exceeded anything available to most legitimate daughters of actual nobility, combined with education and training that reflected her father's recognition that she would eventually need capabilities extending far beyond conventional feminine accomplishments if she were to serve effectively as instrument of family advancement in the complex world of Renaissance politics. Her tutors included some of Rome's most distinguished scholars, whose instruction in languages, literature, music, and dance was supplemented by more practical education in the arts of conversation, negotiation, and psychological manipulation that would prove essential for success in environments where survival depended on understanding hidden motivations and concealed agendas. But perhaps most significantly, Lucrezia's early years were spent observing and learning from her father's systematic transformation of clerical office into instrument of secular power, watching as he employed religious authority to pursue objectives that had nothing to do with spiritual guidance or moral leadership, and everything to do with accumulating wealth. Political influence and territorial control that could secure advantages for family members whose success had become synonymous with his own advancement within church hierarchy. The lessons she absorbed from this daily exposure to ecclesiastical corruption would prove invaluable when she found herself required to operate within similar systems of organized hypocrisy and institutionalized vice. The physical beauty that Lucrezia developed as she matured from child into adolescent was carefully cultivated through systematic attention to diet, exercise, grooming, and fashion that reflected her father's understanding that her appearance would be a crucial component of her effectiveness as political weapon whose deployment would require convincing potential allies that association with the Borgia family could provide access to advantages that justified whatever moral compromises or political risks such relationships might entail. Her golden hair, pale complexion, and graceful bearing were enhanced through cosmetics, clothing, and deportment training that transformed natural attractiveness into carefully engineered instrument of seduction and manipulation. But Lucrezia's education extended far beyond mere physical presentation to encompass sophisticated understanding of psychology, politics, and strategy that would enable her to function effectively in environments where personal relationships served as cover for complex negotiations involving territorial disputes, commercial arrangements, and military alliances whose success or failure could determine the fate of entire regions within the constantly shifting landscape of Italian political competition. Her instruction in these subjects was provided not through formal academic study, but through direct participation in family discussions and strategic planning sessions, where she learned to analyze situations, evaluate options, and anticipate consequences with skills that exceeded those of most professional diplomats and military commanders. The transformation of Lucrezia from protected child into political asset accelerated dramatically as her father's own career advanced through systematic corruption of electoral processes and intimidation of potential opponents whose resistance to Borgia influence was overcome through combination of bribery, blackmail, and carefully orchestrated violence that demonstrated the family's willingness to employ any methods necessary to achieve their objectives, as Cardinal Rodrigo's prospects for papal election improved through elimination or neutralization of rival candidates, Lucrezia's value as marriage prize increased proportionally, creating opportunities for alliances that could secure support for his candidacy while establishing foundations for future political dominance. By 1492, when Rodrigo Borgia achieved his ultimate ambition through purchasing the papal throne and assuming the name Alexander VI, Lucrezia had been transformed from bastard child into strategic asset, whose deployment would be essential for consolidating papal authority while advancing family interests that had become indistinguishable from church policy throughout territories under Vatican control. Her marriage prospects were no longer limited by questions about her legitimacy or concerns about her father's clerical status. They had been elevated into instruments of papal diplomacy whose successful implementation could reshape the balance of power throughout Italy and beyond. The 12-year-old girl who witnessed her father's coronation as pope understood that she was observing not just ecclesiastical ceremony, but transformation of religious office into instrument of secular ambition, whose success would require her own sacrifice on altars of political necessity that recognized no distinction between sacred and profane when family advancement was at stake. The papal throne that Alexander VI had purchased with Spanish gold and Borgia promises would be defended through strategic deployment of his daughter's body and beauty in marriages that would serve as the weapons of war conducted through negotiations rather than military campaigns. The bastard daughter whose existence had once threatened to destroy her father's career had become the Pope's most valuable asset, a weapon whose effectiveness would be measured not in battles won or territories conquered, but in alliances secured and enemies neutralized through intimate connections that transformed political opponents into family members whose interests became aligned with Borgia objectives through bonds that could not be severed without destroying their own positions and prospects. As the bells of St. Peter's announced the beginning of Alexander VI's pontificate to the Christian world, Lucrezia Borgia prepared to begin her career as instrument of papal policy, whose success would require her to navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics while maintaining the facade of innocent daughter, whose marriages represented love matches rather than military campaigns conducted through bedroom diplomacy. The Pope's bastard had become the Vatican's most dangerous weapon, and her deployment would reshape not just Italian politics but the very nature of papal authority for generations to come. The documents discovered in Alexander VI's tomb 5 centuries later would reveal the systematic planning and ruthless calculation that had transformed his daughter from liability into asset, from scandal into salvation, from bastard child into political weapon, whose strategic marriages would secure advantages that no amount of military force or diplomatic negotiation could achieve through conventional means. The Pope who had purchased his throne with gold would defend it with his daughter's body, and the Christian world would witness how sacred authority could be wielded in service of secular ambition without regard for moral limitations or spiritual consequences that might otherwise constrain such systematic corruption of religious office. Chapter 2. The Cardinal's Ambition. The transformation of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia from ambitious Spanish nobleman into the most powerful man in Christendom represented one of the most calculated ascents to supreme authority in European history, a systematic campaign that treated every relationship, every alliance, and every scandal as potential stepping stones toward the papal throne that had obsessed him since his arrival in Rome as a young man with nothing to recommend him except intelligence, ruthlessness, and an absolute conviction that divine authority was simply another form of temporal power that could be acquired through superior strategy and more complete dedication to victory than competitors possessed. Rodrigo understood that achieving papal election required more than just ecclesiastical qualifications or spiritual reputation. It demanded the systematic accumulation of political debts, financial resources, and human instruments that could be deployed to influence the complex dynamics of cardinal politics, where personal animosities, family rivalries, and regional loyalties often mattered more than theological considerations in determining who would wear the tiara and wield the keys of St. Peter. His Spanish origins, which initially marked him as outsider in the Italian-dominated ecclesiastical hierarchy, became advantages once he recognized that foreign birth could provide neutrality in disputes between established Roman families, while Spanish connections offered access to resources and territories that Italian rivals could not match. But Rodrigo's most significant insight was his recognition that papal authority in Renaissance Italy functioned essentially as secular monarchy disguised by a religious ceremony, where success required mastery of the same political arts that enabled princes to conquer territories and kings to maintain dynasties. The sacred nature of ecclesiastical office provided additional legitimacy and resources for temporal ambitions, but it did not eliminate the fundamental requirements for political survival that characterized all forms of supreme authority in an age when power was maintained through careful management of competing interests rather than abstract respect for institutional traditions. The strategy that Rodrigo developed for achieving papal election involved creating a network of obligations and dependencies among fellow cardinals whose support could be purchased through various combinations of financial incentives, political favours, and personal services that made his eventual election appear inevitable, rather than merely desirable to men whose own ambitions could be advanced through association with someone whose resources exceeded their own, while his gratitude for their assistance would translate into concrete benefits once he possessed the power to distribute papal privileges and territories. Central to this strategy was Rodrigo's recognition that his illegitimate children represented potentially valuable political assets whose strategic deployment could secure alliances and neutralize opposition more effectively than traditional methods of ecclesiastical diplomacy. Unlike other cardinal families who were constrained by canonical law or social convention in their use of family relationships for political advancement, Rodrigo's willingness to acknowledge and actively promote his bastard offspring provided him with human resources that could be shaped entirely according to political necessity, without consideration for conventional moral limitations or institutional restrictions. Lucrezia's role in her father's papal ambitions became apparent during her early adolescence, when Rodrigo began including her in social occasions, where her beauty and intelligence could create favourable impressions among cardinals and secular nobles whose support would be crucial for his eventual election campaign. These carefully orchestrated appearances served multiple purposes, demonstrating Rodrigo's confidence in his family's social acceptance, while providing opportunities for potential allies to observe the quality of human resources that would be available for future political arrangements once he achieved supreme ecclesiastical authority. But Rodrigo's use of Lucrezia as political instrument during this period also revealed his sophisticated understanding of masculine psychology and the ways that access to beautiful, intelligent women could create emotional dependencies and obligations that were often more binding than formal treaties or financial agreements. The cardinals and nobles who were charmed by Lucrezia's company during her father's social events understood implicitly that her future availability for marriage represented potential benefit of supporting Rodrigo's ambitions, while her current inaccessibility maintained their interest and prevented premature commitments that could compromise his negotiating position. The papal election of 1492 provided the ultimate test of Rodrigo's decades-long campaign to position himself as the inevitable choice for supreme ecclesiastical authority. The conclave that convened following the death of Pope Innocent VIII brought together cardinals whose personal and political interests had been carefully catalogued and systematically addressed through years of strategic relationship building that had transformed potential opponents into dependents whose own advancement required Rodrigo's success rather than his failure. The election process itself demonstrated Rodrigo's mastery of the practical politics that governed papal selection, where spiritual qualifications were less important than ability to manage the complex web of obligations, rivalries, and ambitions that characterized the College of Cardinals. His victory was achieved not through superior piety or theological scholarship, but through superior preparation and more complete understanding of what each cardinal required for his support in circumstances where the eventual winner would possess resources sufficient to reward allies and punish enemies according to their behaviour during the election campaign. The transformation of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia into Pope Alexander VI marked the beginning of the most corrupt papal reign in church history, but it also represented the culmination of political strategy that had successfully navigated the complex requirements for achieving supreme authority in Renaissance Europe. His election demonstrated that sacred offices could be acquired through secular methods, when those methods were applied with sufficient intelligence, resources, and moral flexibility to overcome whatever obstacles traditional competitors might deploy. But Alexander VI's papal election also marked the beginning of Lucrezia's transformation from political asset into political weapon. as her father's new position provided both the authority and the resources necessary to arrange marriages that could reshape the balance of power across the Italian peninsula, while securing alliances that would protect and extend Borgia influence throughout Europe. The papal throne provided access to territories, revenues, and diplomatic privileges that could support marriage negotiations with some of the continent's most powerful families, while papal authority offered religious justification for political arrangements that might otherwise have violated canonical law or social convention. The immediate aftermath of Alexander VI's election revealed the extent to which papal power could be deployed in service of family advancement, when wielded by someone who understood ecclesiastical authority primarily as tool for temporal conquest rather than spiritual guidance. The appointments, territorial grants, and political alliances that characterized the early years of his reign demonstrated systematic subordination of church interests to Borgia family objectives, while maintaining sufficient religious credibility to preserve papal legitimacy among European rulers whose own political calculations required recognition of Roman authority. Lucrezia's education during this period evolved to reflect her enhanced political value as daughter of the reigning pope, whose marriage could now provide access to papal favour and church resources that were unavailable through any other means. Her tutors expanded their instruction to include diplomatic protocol, international law, and political theory that would enable her to function effectively as partner to rulers whose territories and interests extended far beyond the Italian peninsula, where most of her previous training had been focused. But perhaps most significantly, Alexander VI's papal election created circumstances that required Lucrezia to develop psychological resilience and emotional detachment that would enable her to maintain personal equilibrium while participating in relationships and activities that served political objectives, regardless of their impact on individual happiness or moral satisfaction. The papal court became a laboratory for testing and refining techniques of influence and manipulation that would prove essential for success in strategic marriages, where personal and political considerations were completely intertwined. The financial resources that papal authority provided enabled Alexander VI to support marriage negotiations and diplomatic initiatives that had been impossible during his years as cardinal, when his influence was limited by ecclesiastical rank and Spanish origins that marked him as outsider in Italian political circles. Papal revenues, territorial grants, and ecclesiastical appointments could now be deployed systematically to create incentives and obligations that made alliance with the Borgia family attractive to secular rulers whose own ambitions could be advanced through papal support. The international recognition that accompanied papal election transformed Rodrigo from ambitious cardinal into European political figure whose decisions affected relationships between major powers, while his family connections became matters of continental rather than merely regional significance. Lucrezia's marriage prospects expanded to include rulers and heirs whose territories spanned multiple countries, while her potential political influence grew to encompass diplomatic relationships that could affect warfare, trade, and territorial arrangements across Western Europe. But the enhanced opportunities that papal authority created for Borgia family advancement also generated corresponding dangers from enemies whose own ambitions were threatened by Alexander VI's systematic subordination of church resources to dynastic objectives. The opposition that emerged from both ecclesiastical and secular sources required constant vigilance and increasingly sophisticated defensive measures that ultimately shaped every aspect of family policy and personal relationships, according to requirements of political survival, rather than individual preference or moral consideration. The cardinal's ambition that had driven Rodrigo's decades-long campaign for papal election had been achieved through methods that created permanent vulnerabilities and obligations requiring continuous management through combinations of reward, punishment, and strategic alliance that consumed every available resource while demanding absolute loyalty from family members whose personal desires were subordinated entirely to collective security and advancement. As Alexander VI consolidated his papal authority during the early years of his reign, Lucrezia found herself transformed from promising political asset into essential instrument of family survival and advancement, whose successful deployment in strategic marriages had become crucial for maintaining the complex web of alliances and obligations that protected Borgia power while enabling continued expansion of influence and territory throughout Renaissance Europe. The golden cage that had shaped her development was about to be replaced by responsibilities and dangers that would test every skill and capability that her extraordinary education had been designed to develop. Chapter 3. The First Sacrifice. The marriage contract that sealed 13-year-old Lucrezia Borgia's fate was signed on a February morning in 1493 when frost covered the windows of the Vatican palace, and her breath formed clouds in the cold air as she stood witness to negotiations that would transform her from cherished daughter into political commodity, whose value was measured entirely by her ability to secure an alliance that could protect her father's papal reign while advancing Borgia territorial ambitions in the volatile landscape of Italian city-state politics. The document that bound her to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro and member of one of Milan's most powerful families, represented more than just a marriage contract. It was a declaration of war against established political arrangements that had excluded Spanish newcomers from the inner circles of Italian power. Giovanni Sforza was 26 years old, a man whose previous marriage had ended with his wife's death in circumstances that had created whispers about his sexual habits and political reliability, but whose family connections made him valuable enough to overlook whatever personal deficiencies might complicate the intimate aspects of marriage to someone who was still a child by any reasonable standard. His position as Lord of Pesaro provided strategic access to territories that could serve Borgia military ambitions, while his kinship with Ludovico Sforza, the powerful Duke of Milan, offered potential protection against French invasions that threatened to destabilize the entire Italian peninsula. But what made Giovanni particularly suitable for Alexander VI's immediate political needs was not his personal qualities or territorial holdings alone, but his desperate circumstances as lesser member of the Sforza dynasty, whose own position depended on maintaining good relationships with more powerful relatives, who could withdraw their protection if his political utility declined or his behaviour created embarrassment for the family reputation. This vulnerability made him a reliable ally who could be controlled through threats as well as rewards, ensuring that the marriage alliance would serve Borgia interests even if circumstances changed in ways that made continued cooperation inconvenient or dangerous. The negotiations that produced Lucrezia's first marriage revealed the systematic calculation with which Renaissance political alliances were constructed, where every detail of dowry, inheritance rights, territorial access, and military obligation was debated with the precision of commercial contracts, while the personal compatibility of the actual participants remained entirely irrelevant to discussions that focused exclusively on political and economic advantages that could be gained through formal union of their families. Alexander VI's representatives approached these negotiations with the confidence of men who understood that papal authority provided leverage that secular rulers could not match, where excommunication, interdict, and denial of sacraments represented weapons that could destroy political careers and territorial holdings more effectively than military campaigns, while church resources offered financial incentives that exceeded what most Italian principalities could provide through conventional diplomatic means. But the Pope's negotiating position also reflected his recognition that Borgia family security depended on establishing alliances that could provide protection against enemies whose opposition to Spanish influence in Italian affairs might eventually translate into military action or political conspiracy designed to eliminate what they considered foreign contamination of traditional power structures. The marriage alliance with the Sforza family represented insurance against isolation that could prove fatal if European political circumstances shifted in ways that threatened papal legitimacy or territorial integrity. Lucrezia's preparation for marriage began immediately following the signing of contracts that legally bound her to a man she had never met, in circumstances that would require her to function as political partner, sexual companion, and potential hostage whose treatment would reflect the success or failure of alliance arrangements that extended far beyond personal relationships into areas of military strategy and international diplomacy that she was expected to influence through intimate access to her husband's decision-making processes. The education that had prepared her for political marriage had included theoretical instruction in wifely duties and household management, but the reality of sexual relationship with an adult male whose psychological needs and physical demands would be entirely beyond her control created challenges that required practical guidance from women whose own experiences in strategic marriages could provide insights that academic preparation could not supply. The matrons who were assigned to instruct Lucrezia in marital obligations included former mistresses and abandoned wives whose knowledge of masculine psychology had been acquired through relationships that had combined romantic attachment with political calculation in ways that could serve as models for managing complex situations where personal and family interests might conflict. The wedding ceremony that took place at the Vatican on June 12, 1493, was designed to demonstrate Borgia power and wealth, while creating public commitment to alliance arrangements that could not easily be dissolved if political circumstances changed, in ways that made continued cooperation inconvenient for either family. The elaborate celebrations that accompanied the religious service served multiple diplomatic purposes, providing opportunities for Alexander VI to display papal magnificence while creating social obligations among wedding guests whose attendance implied recognition of Borgia legitimacy and acceptance of their integration into established Italian political networks. But beneath the ceremonial splendor and diplomatic significance of the wedding, the human reality involved a child being legally transferred to adult male authority in circumstances that would require her to provide sexual services and political support while maintaining emotional equilibrium despite complete lack of preparation for intimate relationships that combined romantic expectation with strategic necessity in ways that could create psychological conflicts requiring constant management to prevent breakdown that could compromise family political objectives. The immediate aftermath of Lucrezia's wedding revealed the extent to which her personal welfare had been subordinated to political considerations that treated her psychological and physical development as secondary concerns compared to her utility as instrument of alliance maintenance and family advancement. Her husband's household at Pesaro represented foreign environment where she was expected to adapt quickly to social customs and political relationships that were governed by Sforza rather than Borgia interests, while maintaining loyalty to family objectives that might eventually conflict with local obligations and personal attachments. The sexual aspects of marriage presented challenges that were both physically and emotionally traumatic for someone whose youth and inexperience made her completely dependent on husband's consideration and patience in circumstances where his political and personal satisfaction were more important than her comfort or psychological adjustment. The marital relationship that developed during the months following the wedding reflected Giovanni's awareness that his wife's political value required careful preservation of her health and reputation, while his own needs for sexual satisfaction and emotional companionship had to be balanced against potential consequences of treatment that could create family conflicts or personal resentments affecting alliance stability. But perhaps most significantly, Lucrezia's first marriage provided practical education in political realities that academic instruction could not have supplied, teaching her through direct experience how intimate relationships functioned when personal and political considerations were completely intertwined, while demonstrating the extent to which individual happiness and autonomy could be sacrificed for family objectives without creating obligations for reciprocal consideration or protection from consequences of strategic decisions made by others. The intelligence networks that connected all major Italian courts ensured that reports about Lucrezia's adjustment to marriage reached Alexander VI regularly, providing him with information about alliance stability, while enabling him to monitor daughter's development as political asset, whose future utility might require modifications in training or circumstances if her current situation proved inadequate for developing capabilities that would be needed for more complex assignments, requiring greater sophistication and independence. The correspondence that passed between Lucrezia and her family during the early months of her marriage revealed growing maturity and political understanding that suggested her traumatic introduction to adult responsibilities was producing desired results despite personal costs that were considered acceptable, given the importance of alliance maintenance for Borgia family security and advancement. Her letters demonstrated increasing sophistication in analysing political relationships, while providing insights into Sforza family dynamics that could prove valuable for future negotiations or conflicts. But the marriage also revealed fundamental incompatibilities between Giovanni's territorial interests and Borgia political objectives that would eventually require resolution through methods that could preserve family alliance while accommodating changing circumstances that made continued cooperation increasingly difficult or impossible. The strategic partnership that had seemed advantageous during initial negotiations was proving inadequate for supporting political ambitions that exceeded what Pesaro's limited resources could sustain, while Giovanni's own priorities began conflicting with obligations that marriage alliance had created. The psychological transformation that Lucrezia underwent during her first year of marriage prepared her for political roles that would require greater independence and more sophisticated understanding of how intimate relationships could be managed to serve strategic objectives while preserving emotional equilibrium necessary for long-term effectiveness, in circumstances where personal sacrifice would be required regularly for family advancement and survival. As political circumstances evolved during 1494 and French invasion threatened to disrupt all existing alliance arrangements throughout the Italian peninsula, Lucrezia's marriage began to appear more liability than asset for Borgia family interests that required flexibility and adaptability that long-term commitments to Sforza territorial priorities could not accommodate. The first sacrifice that had seemed necessary for establishing Borgia credibility and security was revealing limitations that would eventually require even greater sacrifices to overcome through methods that would test every capability that her traumatic introduction to political marriage had been designed to develop. Chapter 4. The Pope's Daughter. The papal bull that officially acknowledged Lucrezia Borgia as beloved daughter of Pope Alexander VI marked a transformation in Renaissance political arrangements that challenged fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical authority, while creating unprecedented opportunities for a teenage girl whose beauty and intelligence had been systematically cultivated to serve purposes that extended far beyond conventional feminine roles into territory that required mastery of arts traditionally reserved for male rulers and diplomats whose power derived from inheritance, military conquest, or institutional appointment rather than strategic deployment of personal relationships and intimate influence. The formal recognition of Lucrezia's status as papal daughter occurred against the backdrop of political crisis that threatened to destroy everything Alexander VI had built during his first year as pope, when French armies under Charles VIII swept through Italy with devastating efficiency that exposed the fundamental weakness of the fragmented city-states, whose mutual hostilities had prevented effective resistance to foreign invasion. The speed with which Italian defences collapsed demonstrated that traditional alliance systems based on regional balance had become obsolete in an age when emerging nation-states could deploy resources that exceeded anything available to local rulers whose territories and populations were insufficient for defending independence against coordinated military campaigns. Alexander VI's response to the French invasion revealed both his political sophistication and his willingness to subordinate ecclesiastical dignity to practical survival requirements that demanded flexibility and moral compromise exceeding anything attempted by previous popes whose circumstances had not required such dramatic departures from conventional religious behaviour. His decision to openly acknowledge and actively promote his illegitimate children represented revolutionary expansion of papal authority that treated church resources as family patrimony, while using sacred office to advance dynastic objectives through methods that secular rulers employed routinely, but which created scandal when applied by someone whose spiritual authority was supposed to transcend temporal ambitions. But the crisis also created opportunities for demonstrating that systematic preparation and strategic thinking could overcome disadvantages of foreign origin and relative newcomer status when applied with sufficient intelligence and ruthlessness to exploit weaknesses in established systems that had become vulnerable through complacency and internal division. The Borgia family's Spanish connections, which had initially marked them as outsiders in Italian politics, suddenly became advantages when Italian independence was threatened by French power that Spanish resources could potentially counterbalance if properly mobilized through diplomatic and military coordination. Lucrezia's role in these developing political arrangements expanded rapidly as Alexander VI recognized that his daughter's marriage connections and personal relationships could provide access to intelligence and influence that conventional diplomatic channels could not achieve, while her youth and apparent innocence offered perfect camouflage for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from enemies whose surveillance networks focused on obvious political actors rather than teenage girls whose participation in serious affairs seemed unlikely or impossible. The transformation of Lucrezia from protected child into active political participant required accelerated development of capabilities that her education had begun, but which practical circumstances now demanded be perfected quickly to meet challenges that could not wait for gradual maturation through conventional experience. The mentors who supervised this intensive training included some of the most sophisticated political operators in Europe, individuals whose expertise in manipulation, deception, and strategic violence had been acquired through careers that required survival in environments where mistakes resulted in exile, imprisonment, or death. The papal court that provided immediate context for Lucrezia's political education was an institution where every conversation served multiple purposes, where romantic attachments were evaluated primarily for their diplomatic utility, and where personal loyalty was always subordinated to family advantage in circumstances that could change rapidly based on shifting international alliances and emerging military threats. The lessons that she absorbed through daily participation in court activities taught her to understand human emotions and relationships as political resources that could be cultivated and exploited for strategic advantage rather than sources of personal satisfaction or individual fulfillment. But perhaps most importantly, Lucrezia's elevation to acknowledged papal daughter provided her with institutional authority and financial resources that enabled independent action in circumstances where her previous dependence on family support had limited her effectiveness as political instrument. The territories and revenues that Alexander VI assigned to her direct control created power base that could support diplomatic initiatives and military activities while providing bargaining position in negotiations where her personal interests might conflict with immediate family objectives. The administrative responsibilities that accompanied Lucrezia's new status required mastery of governmental arts that few women of any rank had been permitted to develop, including financial management, military coordination, judicial administration, and diplomatic negotiation that demanded understanding of legal principles and political theory exceeding what conventional feminine education provided. The practical experience that she gained through managing papal territories provided insights into power relationships and administrative methods that would prove essential for future roles requiring greater independence and more complex decision-making authority. The international attention that focused on Lucrezia following her formal recognition as papal daughter created both opportunities and dangers that required careful management to prevent political complications, while maximizing advantages that her enhanced status could provide for Borgia family objectives. European rulers whose own political calculations had been disrupted by French invasion began evaluating potential marriage alliances that could provide access to papal support, while Lucrezia's increased visibility made her valuable target for enemies seeking leverage against Alexander VI, through threats or actual harm to his acknowledged favourite child. The security arrangements that were implemented to protect Lucrezia from political enemies and personal threats revealed the extent to which her safety had become a crucial component of Borgia family survival strategy that could not tolerate risks to someone whose political utility exceeded her value as mere family member. The guards, informants, and protective protocols that surrounded her daily activities represented investment in human resource whose loss could create vulnerabilities affecting entire political structure that Alexander VI had constructed around systematic deployment of family relationships for territorial and diplomatic advantage. But Lucrezia's enhanced political status also created emotional and psychological pressures that required development of personal resilience exceeding what her previous protected existence had demanded, while maintaining external appearance of feminine grace and religious devotion that could preserve her effectiveness as political instrument, disguised as conventional papal daughter whose activities appeared to conform with traditional expectations about appropriate behaviour for women of her rank and circumstances. The correspondence that Lucrezia maintained with political figures throughout Europe during this period revealed rapidly developing sophistication in diplomatic communication, while demonstrating her growing understanding of international relationships and strategic considerations that affected Borgia family interests across multiple theatres of political and military activity. Her letters showed increasing ability to analyse complex situations while providing insights and recommendations that influenced family policy decisions requiring coordination between territorial administration, military planning, and diplomatic negotiation. The marriage negotiations that began almost immediately following Lucrezia's formal recognition as papal daughter involved discussions with representatives of major European dynasties whose territorial holdings and military capabilities exceeded anything that her previous Sforza alliance could provide, while their political influence offered potential protection against French expansion that threatened to eliminate Italian independence entirely unless effective resistance could be organised through coordinated international intervention. But these enhanced marriage prospects also created complications for existing alliance arrangements that had been predicated on different political circumstances and family priorities that might no longer serve Borgia interests if superior opportunities became available through dissolution of current commitments and formation of new relationships that could provide greater security and advancement potential. The management of these competing obligations required diplomatic sophistication and legal expertise that tested every capability that Lucrezia's intensive political education had been designed to develop. The Pope's daughter had become far more than acknowledged illegitimate child or valuable marriage prospect. She had emerged as independent political actor whose decisions and relationships affected European balance of power, while her personal development represented ongoing experiment in extending feminine influence into areas of authority traditionally reserved for male rulers, whose power derived from inheritance or conquest rather than strategic deployment of intimate relationships and personal charm combined with genuine governmental capability and diplomatic expertise. As French armies continued their devastating progress through Italian territories during 1494 and 1495, Lucrezia's role in Borgia family survival strategy became increasingly crucial, while her personal transformation from protected child into sophisticated political operator demonstrated that systematic preparation and intensive training could produce capabilities that exceeded conventional limitations on feminine participation in serious governmental and diplomatic activities when circumstances required such revolutionary departures from traditional gender roles and social expectations. Chapter 5. Annulment and Scandal. The dissolution of Lucrezia Borgia's first marriage represented one of the most audacious legal manipulations in papal history, a systematic campaign to destroy binding ecclesiastical vows through accusations so scandalous that they challenged fundamental assumptions about masculine honour while demonstrating Alexander VI's willingness to deploy any weapon, including his daughter's sexual reputation, in service of political objectives that required complete flexibility in alliance arrangements, regardless of personal cost to family members whose individual dignity was considered expendable when measured against collective survival and advancement in the deadly game of Renaissance power politics. The political circumstances that necessitated dissolving Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza had evolved rapidly during the months following the French invasion, when shifting international alliances made continued association with Milan's ruling family more liability than asset for Borgia territorial ambitions that required different strategic partnerships capable of providing protection against enemies whose power had grown beyond what existing alliance arrangements could counter effectively. The Sforza connection that had initially offered security and legitimacy had become dangerous encumbrance that prevented pursuit of opportunities requiring freedom from obligations that no longer served family interests. But annulling a consummated marriage between members of prominent noble families required legal justification that could withstand scrutiny from ecclesiastical courts, while avoiding precedents that might encourage other rulers to dissolve inconvenient political marriages through similar mechanisms that could undermine the stability of alliance systems throughout Christian Europe. The canonical requirements for marriage dissolution were deliberately restrictive, designed to prevent casual abandonment of sacred vows that provided foundation for political arrangements affecting entire regions where family relationships determined territorial control and succession rights. Alexander VI's solution to this legal challenge demonstrated both his sophisticated understanding of canon law and his complete willingness to subordinate ecclesiastical dignity to practical political necessity when circumstances demanded resolution of problems that conventional methods could not address effectively. The accusation of impotence that was levelled against Giovanni Sforza represented brilliant exploitation of masculine psychology and legal technicality that made effective defence virtually impossible while creating grounds for annulment that could not be challenged, without admitting to sexual inadequacy that would destroy political credibility and personal reputation more completely than accepting dissolution of unwanted marriage. The formal charges that were brought before ecclesiastical tribunals alleged that Giovanni's physical incapacity had prevented consummation of marriage vows, rendering the union invalid according to canonical requirements that treated sexual union as an essential component of sacramental marriage, whose absence justified dissolution regardless of political or economic considerations that might otherwise require preservation of formal alliance arrangements. The technical nature of these charges made legal defense extremely difficult, while their personal implications created psychological pressure that could force acceptance of annulment rather than public examination of intimate details that would humiliate defendants regardless of eventual judicial outcomes. But the most devastating aspect of Alexander VI's annulment strategy was his systematic deployment of Lucrezia's testimony as crucial evidence supporting allegations that challenged her husband's masculine competence while simultaneously preserving her own reputation through carefully constructed legal arguments that attributed marriage failure to Giovanni's inadequacy, rather than her unwillingness to fulfill wifely obligations that political circumstances now made inconvenient for family objectives requiring different alliance arrangements. Lucrezia's participation in these proceedings required psychological sophistication and emotional detachment that exceeded anything her previous experience had demanded, while demonstrating her complete commitment to family interests regardless of personal cost in terms of dignity, reputation, or individual relationships that might be destroyed through legal strategies designed to achieve political objectives without consideration for human consequences affecting people whose lives were disrupted by decisions made according to calculations that treated personal welfare as irrelevant compared to collective advancement and security. The ecclesiastical hearings that examined evidence for marriage annulment created public spectacle that combined legal drama with sexual scandal in ways that attracted international attention, while providing entertainment for audiences whose fascination with intimate details of noble family relationships offered temporary distraction from political anxieties created by ongoing warfare and diplomatic instability throughout Europe. The proceedings became theatre where personal humiliation served political purposes, while demonstrating papal power to manipulate legal institutions according to family requirements that transcended conventional respect for canonical law or individual dignity. Giovanni Sforza's response to these accusations revealed both his desperation and his recognition that effective resistance was impossible when confronting papal authority supported by legal expertise and political resources that exceeded anything available to provincial nobles whose territorial holdings and family connections were insufficient for challenging decisions made by someone who controlled both ecclesiastical courts and international alliance arrangements. His threats to expose Borgia family secrets demonstrated awareness of vulnerability that his knowledge of intimate details could create, but also revealed his understanding that such revelations would destroy his own reputation while providing evidence that could justify severe retaliation from enemies whose power exceeded his ability to resist or escape. The negotiations that ultimately produced Giovanni's acceptance of annulment proceedings involved financial compensation and political concessions that satisfied his immediate material needs, while providing face-saving explanations that could minimize public humiliation associated with accusations of sexual inadequacy that would otherwise have destroyed his prospects for future marriage and political advancement. The settlement that was reached demonstrated Alexander VI's sophisticated understanding of masculine psychology and the practical requirements for managing political opposition through combinations of threat and reward that made cooperation more attractive than continued resistance. But the annulment proceedings also established legal and political precedents that would affect marriage arrangements throughout European nobility, where rulers recognized that papal authority could potentially dissolve any alliance if circumstances made such action politically advantageous for Vatican interests, while the methods employed against Giovanni Sforza provided template for future manipulations that could be adapted to different situations requiring similar flexibility in international relationships and dynastic arrangements. The formal declaration of marriage nullity that was issued by ecclesiastical courts in December 1497 represented complete legal victory that eliminated all canonical obstacles to Lucrezia's remarriage, while preserving her reputation and eligibility for future alliances that could serve Borgia political objectives more effectively than previous arrangements, had proved capable of supporting during periods of international crisis and shifting alliance requirements. The judicial decision confirmed papal power to manipulate church law according to political necessity, while demonstrating that individual dignity and personal relationships were expendable resources when measured against collective family interests. But the personal cost of these proceedings for Lucrezia included psychological trauma and social humiliation that required emotional resilience exceeding what her previous protected existence had developed while teaching lessons about political reality that academic education could not have provided regarding the extent to which personal relationships and individual autonomy were subordinated to family objectives in circumstances where survival required absolute flexibility and complete subordination of private desires to collective strategic requirements. The international reaction to Lucrezia's annulment revealed widespread recognition that Borgia family methods exceeded conventional limits of political manipulation, while demonstrating capabilities that made them simultaneously valuable allies and dangerous enemies whose friendship required constant attention to their interests, while their enmity could result in consequences extending far beyond normal diplomatic or military retaliation to include personal destruction, through scandal and legal persecution that conventional defences could not prevent. The scandal that surrounded these proceedings enhanced rather than diminished Lucrezia's political value by demonstrating her complete dedication to family objectives while revealing psychological resilience and strategic sophistication that made her even more attractive as potential marriage partner for rulers whose own political circumstances required alliance with someone capable of functioning effectively in complex diplomatic environments where personal and political considerations were completely intertwined. An individual success depended on ability to subordinate private desires to collective strategic requirements. As negotiations began for Lucrezia's second marriage, the annulment of her first union had established her reputation as a political instrument whose deployment could reshape alliance arrangements, while demonstrating that Borgia family power included capability to manipulate legal institutions and social conventions according to strategic requirements that transcended conventional moral limitations or canonical restrictions when circumstances demanded such revolutionary approaches to achieving political objectives that could not be accomplished through traditional diplomatic methods or military conquest alone. Chapter 6. The Brother's Shadow. The relationship between Lucrezia Borgia and her brother Cesare transcended conventional sibling bonds to become something far more dangerous and psychologically complex. A partnership that combined genuine intellectual compatibility with strategic political collaboration and rumoured intimate connection that created one of the most powerful and notorious alliances in Renaissance Europe, while generating scandals that would define the Borgia family's reputation for centuries as embodiment of aristocratic corruption that exceeded all previous boundaries of acceptable behaviour, even in an age when papal courts routinely violated both canonical law and conventional morality in pursuit of temporal power and dynastic advancement. Cesare Borgia was 4 years older than Lucrezia, a man whose combination of exceptional intelligence, ruthless ambition, and complete moral flexibility had made him the primary instrument of Alexander VI's territorial expansion, while his personal charisma and strategic brilliance attracted admiration from political theorists like Niccolo Machiavelli, who recognized in him the perfect embodiment of effective princely authority, unconstrained by traditional ethical limitations or religious scruples that might interfere with practical requirements for achieving and maintaining political dominance through superior force and more sophisticated understanding of human psychology than competitors possessed. But what made the relationship between Cesare and Lucrezia particularly significant for Borgia family political strategy was not their individual capabilities alone, but their complementary strengths that enabled coordination of activities spanning both military conquest and diplomatic seduction, while maintaining emotional connection that provided psychological stability and mutual support in circumstances where isolation and betrayal were constant threats, requiring absolute trust between family members whose survival depended on their ability to function as unified political organism rather than collection of individuals pursuing separate objectives. The rumours of incestuous relationship between Cesare and Lucrezia that began circulating throughout European courts during the mid-1490s reflected both genuine evidence of unusual intimacy and deliberate political propaganda designed to discredit Borgia family influence through accusations that challenged fundamental assumptions about human decency, while exploiting popular fascination with aristocratic sexual scandal that provided entertainment for audiences whose own moral standards were sufficiently flexible to tolerate systematic violence and political corruption, but drew the line at violations of family relationships that represented ultimate transgression against Christian civilization. The truth about the nature of Cesare and Lucrezia's relationship remained deliberately ambiguous, cultivated through carefully orchestrated public appearances and private communications that suggested intimate connection while maintaining sufficient uncertainty to prevent definitive proof that could be used by enemies seeking legal or religious grounds for challenging papal authority through accusations of behaviour that exceeded even Renaissance tolerance for ecclesiastical corruption and moral flexibility among ruling families whose power was based on systematic violation of conventional ethical standards. But whether or not physical intimacy actually characterized their relationship, the psychological bond between Cesare and Lucrezia created political partnership that enabled coordination of activities requiring unprecedented levels of mutual trust and shared commitment to family objectives that transcended individual desires or personal safety considerations in circumstances where betrayal by either sibling could result in destruction of everything that Alexander VI had built through decades of strategic manipulation and systematic accumulation of power that had transformed Spanish upstarts into dominant force in Italian politics. The strategic deployment of incest rumours as political weapon demonstrated Borgia family sophistication in managing public perception and enemy propaganda, while recognising that scandal could serve their interests as effectively as conventional diplomacy when properly manipulated to create fear and fascination among potential allies and opponents whose behaviour could be influenced through psychological pressure as well as financial incentives or military threats that characterised more obvious forms of political coercion and alliance building. Cesare's military campaigns throughout central Italy during the late 1490s and early 1500s relied heavily on intelligence and diplomatic support that Lucrezia provided through her marriage connections and social relationships with noble families whose territorial holdings and political loyalties affected the success or failure of territorial conquest that required coordination between military force and political manipulation to achieve lasting results rather than temporary occupation that could be reversed when circumstances changed or resistance organised more effectively. The systematic nature of Cesare's conquest revealed strategic thinking that treated territorial expansion as a comprehensive political project requiring integration of military, diplomatic and administrative methods that could transform conquered territories into permanent additions to Borgia domains, rather than mere military victories that would require constant defence against local resistance and external intervention. Lucrezia's role in these campaigns involved both intelligence gathering and diplomatic negotiation that exploited her access to court circles, where military planning and political opposition could be monitored and influenced through personal relationships that provided insights unavailable through conventional espionage networks. But the collaboration between Cesare and Lucrezia also created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through strategies designed to separate them or turn their psychological dependence into liability when circumstances made their mutual support impossible or dangerous for collective family interests. The intensity of their partnership made both siblings more effective political operators, while simultaneously creating emotional dependencies that could be manipulated by opponents whose own strategic thinking included psychological warfare designed to exploit personal relationships and individual weaknesses for political advantage. The influence that Cesare exercised over Lucrezia's personal relationships and marriage negotiations reflected both his protective instincts and his recognition that her political value required careful management to prevent emotional attachments or personal commitments that could compromise her effectiveness as family political instrument. His involvement in selecting and evaluating potential husbands demonstrated understanding that Lucrezia's intimate relationships must serve Borgia's strategic objectives, rather than her individual happiness or emotional fulfillment when circumstances required sacrifice of personal desires for collective advancement and security. The psychological complexity of their relationship also provided Lucrezia with emotional anchor that enabled her to maintain personal equilibrium despite traumatic experiences and moral compromises that would have destroyed someone whose identity and self-worth were not supported by absolute connection to family member, whose understanding and acceptance remained constant regardless of whatever activities political circumstances required her to undertake or endure for collective benefit and strategic advantage. The social scandal that surrounded rumours of their intimate relationship served multiple political functions by creating public fascination that enhanced their individual reputations for dangerous sophistication while demonstrating family unity and mutual loyalty that could deter potential enemies whose own moral vulnerabilities made them susceptible to similar accusations or personal destruction through systematic exposure of private behaviour that violated conventional social expectations or religious requirements. But perhaps most significantly, the relationship between Cesare and Lucrezia represented evolution in Renaissance political methods that recognised intimate personal connections as potentially more reliable and effective than formal alliance arrangements or financial obligations when circumstances required absolute trust and coordinated action in situations where betrayal or miscommunication could result in immediate destruction of everything that systematic planning and strategic patience had achieved over years of careful political manoeuvring. The brother's shadow that followed Lucrezia throughout her adult life provided both protection and constraint that shaped every major decision while ensuring that her individual development remained subordinated to collective family objectives that required her continued effectiveness as political instrument, regardless of personal costs or individual desires that might conflict with strategic requirements, determined by Cesare's military campaigns and Alexander VI's territorial ambitions that treated human relationships as resources to be deployed according to tactical necessity rather than emotional satisfaction or moral consideration. As Lucrezia approached her second marriage negotiations during 1498, her relationship with Cesare had become a central component of Borgia family political strategy that could not be modified or eliminated without compromising operational effectiveness, that depended on psychological bonds and strategic coordination that exceeded what formal alliances or financial arrangements could provide in circumstances where survival required capabilities that only genuine intimacy and absolute mutual trust could sustain when facing enemies whose resources and determination exceeded what individual effort or conventional political methods could overcome through normal diplomatic or military means. Chapter 7. The Second Weapon. The marriage contract that bound 17-year-old Lucrezia Borgia to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, represented a fundamental shift in papal political strategy from defensive alliance building to aggressive territorial expansion that would reshape the balance of power throughout southern Italy, while demonstrating Alexander VI's growing confidence in his family's ability to challenge established dynasties whose authority had previously seemed beyond the reach of Spanish upstarts, whose legitimacy was questioned by Italian nobility that still considered the Borgias dangerous interlopers, rather than equals in the ancient game of peninsular politics and dynastic marriage arrangements. Alfonso was 19 years old, the illegitimate son of King Alfonso II of Naples, whose Aragonese bloodline provided direct connection to Spanish royal authority, while his territorial holdings in the Kingdom of Naples offered strategic access to resources and military positions that could support Borgia expansion southward from their central Italian power base toward objectives that included eventual control over one of Europe's wealthiest and most strategically important regions, where trade routes between East and West created opportunities for accumulating wealth that could fund unlimited political and military ambitions. But what made Alfonso particularly valuable for Alexander VI's evolving strategic vision was not his personal qualities or individual capabilities, which were conventional enough for a bastard prince whose primary assets consisted of good looks, adequate education, and family connections that provided social legitimacy without creating obligations to more powerful relatives whose interests might conflict with Borgia, objectives requiring complete subordination of alliance partners to papal family priorities that transcended conventional diplomatic courtesy or feudal reciprocity in favour of absolute loyalty to collective advancement goals. The political circumstances that made the Aragonese marriage both possible and necessary reflected dramatic changes in international power relationships following the French invasion of Italy, when traditional alliance systems had collapsed under pressure from emerging nation-states whose military capabilities and territorial ambitions exceeded what fragmented Italian city-states could resist through conventional diplomatic arrangements or regional cooperation that had proved inadequate for defending independence against coordinated foreign intervention designed to eliminate Italian autonomy entirely through systematic conquest and political subordination. Alexander VI's decision to pursue alliance with the Kingdom of Naples represented calculated response to shifting international dynamics that required Borgia family alignment with Spanish interests capable of providing protection against French expansion, while offering opportunities for territorial acquisition that could transform papal domains from modest central Italian holdings into substantial Mediterranean power base, supporting ambitions that extended throughout Europe and potentially into territories where Spanish colonial expansion was creating unprecedented opportunities for wealth accumulation and political influence. The negotiations that produced Lucrezia's second marriage revealed sophisticated understanding of international law and dynastic relationships that enabled Alexander VI to secure alliance arrangements, providing immediate military support while establishing legal foundations for future territorial claims that could be activated when circumstances permitted more aggressive pursuit of expansion objectives requiring legitimacy that only marriage connections with established royal families could provide in political environments where genealogical relationships determined inheritance rights and succession arrangements. But the alliance also reflected Alexander VI's recognition that Borgia family security required diversification of international relationships that could provide protection against enemies whose power exceeded what any single alliance arrangement could counter effectively, while creating multiple options for future strategic development that could adapt to changing circumstances without requiring fundamental revision of territorial objectives or political methods that had proved successful in transforming Spanish clerical family into major European political force through systematic exploitation of papal authority and dynastic marriage arrangements. Lucrezia's preparation for her second marriage incorporated lessons learned from her traumatic first experience while reflecting enhanced understanding of political requirements for functioning effectively as partner to someone whose territorial responsibilities and family obligations created complex relationship dynamics, where personal and political considerations were completely intertwined in ways that demanded greater sophistication and emotional resilience than her previous marriage had required during its brief and ultimately unsuccessful duration. The educational program that prepared Lucrezia for marriage to Neapolitan nobility included intensive instruction in southern Italian political relationships, regional history, and cultural traditions that would enable her to function effectively in social environment where Aragonese customs and Spanish influence created different expectations about feminine behaviour and aristocratic protocol than she had encountered in central Italian courts, where Borgia family influence had provided protection, an advantage that might not be available in territories where her husband's family relationships determined social position and political effectiveness. But perhaps most importantly, Lucrezia's preparation for her second marriage included systematic development of capabilities for independent political action that could serve Borgia family interests even when her husband's priorities conflicted with papal objectives or family loyalty, demanded activities that exceeded conventional widely duties, or social expectations about appropriate feminine behaviour in circumstances where individual initiative and strategic thinking were more valuable than passive compliance with masculine authority or traditional gender role limitations. The wedding ceremony that took place at the Vatican on July 21, 1498, demonstrated Borgia confidence and international legitimacy while creating public commitment to alliance arrangements that provided immediate political benefits, including military support for ongoing territorial campaigns and diplomatic recognition from European powers, whose acceptance of Borgia marriage connections validated their integration into established aristocratic networks, despite continuing opposition from enemies who questioned their right to participate in major international political arrangements as equals rather than subordinates. Alfonso's personality and political capabilities proved more compatible with Lucrezia's evolved sophistication and enhanced authority than her previous marriage had provided, creating domestic partnership that combined genuine emotional attachment with strategic political collaboration in ways that served both individual happiness and family objectives, without requiring sacrifice of personal satisfaction for collective advancement or subordination of individual development to political necessity that had characterized her traumatic first marriage experience. The territorial administration that Lucrezia assumed in connection with her second marriage provided opportunities for developing governmental skills and political independence that exceeded anything her previous experience had offered, while demonstrating her growing capabilities for managing complex administrative responsibilities that required coordination of financial, military and diplomatic activities in circumstances where effective leadership demanded understanding of regional politics and international relationships extending far beyond conventional feminine education or aristocratic social accomplishments. But the marriage also created new vulnerabilities for Borgia family political strategy by establishing emotional attachments and personal commitments that could compromise Lucrezia's effectiveness as political instrument if circumstances required sacrifice of individual happiness for collective objectives, or if Alfonso's family loyalties conflicted with papal territorial ambitions in ways that demanded choice between husband's interests and family obligations that had previously provided foundation for all major life decisions and strategic planning. The genuine affection that developed between Lucrezia and Alfonso during the first months of their marriage created both personal satisfaction and political complications as their relationship evolved beyond strategic alliance into emotional partnership that provided psychological stability and domestic happiness, while simultaneously generating obligations and loyalties that could potentially conflict with Borgia family requirements for absolute dedication to collective advancement, regardless of individual costs or personal preferences, when circumstances demanded sacrifice of private desires for strategic necessity. The intelligence networks that connected all major Italian courts provided regular reports about Lucrezia's marriage that enabled Alexander VI and Cesare to monitor alliance stability while assessing potential threats or opportunities created by her emotional attachment to husband, whose political reliability had not been tested through circumstances requiring choice between family loyalty and personal relationships that might compromise effectiveness as Borgia political instrument when strategic requirements conflicted with domestic obligations or individual happiness. As international political circumstances continued evolving during 1499 and 1500, with Spanish and French forces competing for control over southern Italian territories, where Alfonso's inheritance rights and family connections created potential complications for alliance arrangements that had been negotiated under different strategic assumptions, Lucrezia's second marriage began revealing both advantages and limitations of diplomatic relationships that combined genuine emotional attachment with political necessity in ways that could strengthen or weaken family position depending on how successfully personal and strategic considerations could be balanced, when circumstances required difficult choices between individual happiness and collective survival. The second weapon that Lucrezia had become through her marriage to Alfonso represented evolution in Borgia political methodology that recognized emotional authenticity as potentially valuable component of strategic relationships while creating new challenges for maintaining absolute family loyalty. When personal attachments generated competing obligations that might eventually require resolution through methods that could test every capability that her enhanced political education and traumatic previous experience had been designed to develop for circumstances where survival demanded subordination of individual desires to collective strategic requirements regardless of personal cost or emotional consequences. Chapter 8. Blood in the Vatican. The assassination of Alfonso of Aragon on August 18, 1500, transformed the papal palace from sanctuary of Christian authority into crime scene that would shock even Renaissance Italy's violence-hardened political observers, while demonstrating that Borgia family commitment to strategic objectives transcended any consideration for individual happiness, emotional attachment, or conventional moral limitations when circumstances required elimination of obstacles to territorial expansion and political advancement that could not be overcome through negotiation, bribery, or other methods that preserved the fiction of civilized political behavior among ruling families, whose power ultimately rested on systematic violence, disguised by legal formalities and religious ceremony. The murder occurred during the height of summer when Rome's oppressive heat created atmospheric conditions that seemed to reflect the moral climate surrounding papal court activities, where systematic corruption had evolved beyond conventional ecclesiastical misconduct into comprehensive abandonment of Christian principles in favour of dynastic ambitions that treated human life as expendable resource to be eliminated when strategic calculations demanded removal of individuals whose continued existence threatened family objectives, requiring absolute flexibility in alliance arrangements and territorial policies. Alfonso had been recovering from wounds sustained during a previous assassination attempt that had failed to achieve its objective due to inadequate planning and execution that allowed victim to survive initial attack while creating public attention and political complications that made subsequent efforts more difficult and dangerous for perpetrators, whose involvement could be traced through evidence left by incomplete elimination of target whose death had become necessary for advancing Borgia territorial ambitions in southern Italy, where competing claims and conflicting loyalties required resolution through methods that exceeded conventional diplomatic solutions. The second and successful assassination was conducted with systematic precision that eliminated evidence and witnesses while creating circumstances that made investigation impossible, and retaliation impractical for victims' family members whose own political positions were too vulnerable to permit open challenge to papal authority, backed by military force and international alliance arrangements that exceeded what Neapolitan nobility could mobilize in response to violence that officially appeared to result from factional conflicts, rather than deliberate papal policy designed to eliminate inconvenient obligations and personal attachments. Lucrezia's role in her husband's murder remained deliberately ambiguous, cultivated through carefully orchestrated appearances and emotional reactions that suggested grief and shock while maintaining sufficient uncertainty about her actual involvement or prior knowledge to prevent definitive conclusions that could compromise her political value for future marriage negotiations, requiring preservation of reputation and eligibility, despite circumstances that had eliminated inconvenient emotional attachments threatening to compromise effectiveness as family political instrument, when strategic requirements demanded absolute loyalty to collective objectives. The psychological impact of Alfonso's assassination on Lucrezia revealed both her emotional vulnerability and her remarkable capacity for compartmentalization that enabled her to function effectively, despite traumatic loss of genuine romantic relationship that had provided personal happiness and domestic stability during a period when individual satisfaction had been permitted to coexist with family political obligations, without creating fundamental conflicts requiring choice between private desires and strategic necessity that characterized most aspects of Borgia family relationships. But the murder also demonstrated Lucrezia's complete integration into family power structure that treated individual welfare as subordinate to collective advancement, while revealing her acceptance of violence as necessary component of political effectiveness, when circumstances made elimination of obstacles preferable to continued negotiation or accommodation that could compromise territorial objectives, requiring flexibility and decisiveness that conventional moral constraints might otherwise prevent through ethical limitations on available methods for achieving strategic goals. The investigation that followed Alfonso's assassination was conducted with deliberate incompetence, designed to prevent discovery of evidence that could implicate papal family members while creating official record that attributed violence to regional conflicts and personal animosities that absolved church authorities of responsibility for activities that exceeded acceptable bounds of ecclesiastical behavior, even by Renaissance standards that tolerated substantial corruption and moral flexibility among religious leaders whose temporal interests often conflicted with spiritual obligations. The international reaction to Alfonso's murder revealed widespread recognition that Borgia family methods exceeded conventional limits of political violence, while demonstrating papal willingness to eliminate alliance partners whose continued existence threatened strategic objectives that could not accommodate emotional attachments or personal commitments, when circumstances required absolute freedom for pursuing territorial expansion and dynastic advancement through marriage arrangements that served family interests rather than individual happiness or romantic compatibility. Cesare Borgia's direct involvement in planning and executing his brother-in-law's assassination reflected his recognition that Lucrezia's emotional attachment to Alfonso represented potential threat to family unity and strategic effectiveness that required elimination through methods that preserved her political value, while removing obstacles to future deployment as marriage partner for more suitable alliance arrangements, serving territorial objectives that Neapolitan connections could not adequately support, given changing international circumstances and military requirements. The systematic nature of the assassination planning revealed organizational capabilities and operational security that exceeded what conventional criminal activities could achieve, while demonstrating institutional resources and professional expertise available through papal authority and military organizations that enabled complex operations requiring coordination between multiple participants whose different skills and positions provided comprehensive capability for eliminating political obstacles through violence that left minimal evidence and maximum deterrent effect on potential enemies. But perhaps most significantly, Alfonso's murder established psychological precedent that would govern all subsequent Borgia family relationships by demonstrating that emotional attachments and personal commitments were expendable resources that could be eliminated when strategic circumstances demanded absolute flexibility in alliance arrangements and territorial policies that treated human life as disposable commodity rather than moral consideration, requiring ethical constraints on available methods for achieving political objectives through systematic violence and intimidation. The cover-up operations that followed the assassination required coordination between ecclesiastical authorities, military officials, and diplomatic representatives whose cooperation was secured through combinations of reward, threat, and institutional loyalty that prevented effective investigation while creating alternative narratives that explained Alfonso's death through regional conflicts and personal animosities rather than systematic papal policy designed to eliminate inconvenient alliance obligations and emotional attachments that threatened strategic flexibility. Lucrezia's public behaviour during the mourning period following her husband's death revealed careful calculation designed to maintain reputation for appropriate feminine grief, while avoiding excessive emotional display that could compromise future marriage negotiations, requiring preservation of political value and social eligibility, despite circumstances that had eliminated romantic relationship, providing genuine personal satisfaction and emotional stability during a period when individual happiness had been permitted to coexist with family strategic requirements. The financial arrangements that were implemented following Alfonso's death included confiscation of his territorial holdings and inheritance rights that provided immediate material benefits for papal treasury, while eliminating legal complications that his continued existence might have created for future Borgia territorial claims and succession arrangements, requiring clear title and undisputed authority over lands and resources needed for supporting military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives throughout central and southern Italy. The blood that stained the Vatican floors during Alfonso's assassination represented more than evidence of individual murder. It marked transformation of papal authority into instrument of systematic violence that exceeded conventional limits of political ruthlessness, while demonstrating complete subordination of Christian moral principles to dynastic ambitions that treated sacred office as a resource for advancing family territorial objectives through methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical behaviour and religious authority in European political arrangements. As news of Alfonso's assassination spread throughout European courts during late 1500, Lucrezia's reputation evolved from grieving widow into dangerous political operator whose involvement in her husband's murder remained sufficiently ambiguous to preserve marriage eligibility while demonstrating capabilities for strategic violence that made her simultaneously attractive and terrifying prospect for rulers whose own political circumstances required alliance with someone capable of eliminating obstacles through systematic planning and coordinated execution that exceeded what conventional diplomatic methods or financial incentives could achieve when strategic objectives demanded absolute dedication to family advancement, regardless of moral consequences or individual emotional costs. The blood in the Vatican had washed away more than Alfonso's life. It had eliminated the last vestiges of conventional morality that might have constrained Borgia family political methods, while establishing precedents for systematic violence that would characterize all subsequent operations requiring removal of obstacles to territorial expansion and dynastic advancement through marriage arrangements serving strategic, rather than romantic objectives, in circumstances where individual happiness was considered irrelevant compared to collective political effectiveness and family survival in increasingly dangerous international environment. Chapter 9. The Regent's Power. The appointment of Lucrezia Borgia as papal regent over the strategically crucial territories of Spoleto and Foligno in September 1499 marked a revolutionary expansion of feminine authority that challenged fundamental assumptions about governance and political capability, while demonstrating Alexander VI's recognition that his daughter's intelligence and strategic sophistication exceeded what conventional masculine administrators could provide in circumstances requiring absolute loyalty combined with exceptional competence for managing complex territorial administration, military coordination, and diplomatic relationships that determined success or failure of Borgia expansion throughout central Italy, where effective regional control was essential for supporting larger ambitions that extended across the entire peninsula. The territories that were placed under Lucrezia's direct authority represented more than administrative assignment. They constituted crucial strategic positions controlling mountain passes and commercial routes that connected northern and southern Italy, while providing defensive positions that could protect papal domains from military intervention by enemies whose territorial ambitions required prevention of Borgia. consolidation in regions where effective control could enable systematic expansion toward objectives that included eventual domination of Italian political arrangements through superior organization and more sophisticated understanding of governmental methods than fragmented city-state rivals possessed. But Lucrezia's appointment as regent also reflected Alexander VI's calculated assessment that feminine authority could provide psychological and political advantages that masculine rule might not achieve in territories where local populations had experienced decades of exploitation and misgovernment by male administrators whose primary interests involved personal enrichment and factional conflict rather than effective territorial administration or economic development that could generate resources and loyalty necessary for supporting long-term strategic objectives, requiring sustained commitment and systematic planning, extending beyond immediate military conquest. The governmental responsibilities that Lucrezia assumed included comprehensive authority over taxation, military recruitment, judicial administration, and diplomatic relations with neighbouring territories, whose cooperation or hostility could affect strategic value of her domains, while her decisions regarding resource allocation, defensive preparations, and alliance arrangements required understanding of international political relationships and military strategy that exceeded what conventional feminine education provided, but which her intensive political training and practical experience had prepared her to master through systematic application of intelligence and determination. The administrative innovations that Lucrezia implemented during her regency revealed sophisticated understanding of governmental theory and practical management techniques that enabled her to achieve territorial prosperity and political stability, exceeding what previous administrators had accomplished, while demonstrating capabilities for independent decision-making and strategic planning that validated Alexander VI's confidence in her ability to function effectively as autonomous political authority rather than merely decorative representative of papal power, whose activities required constant supervision and external guidance. The military organization that Lucrezia established within her territories included professional soldiers whose loyalty was secured through regular payment and equitable treatment that contrasted favorably with exploitative practices characteristic of mercenary companies whose allegiance could be purchased by highest bidders, while her systematic approach to defensive preparations and intelligence gathering created security arrangements that protected her domains from external threats, while providing base for supporting Cesare's military campaigns throughout neighbouring regions. Where Borgia territorial expansion required coordination between multiple administrative and military authorities, but perhaps most significantly, Lucrezia's exercise of regent authority demonstrated her evolution from political instrument into independent operator, whose decision-making capabilities and strategic vision enabled her to advance family objectives while pursuing initiatives that reflected her own understanding of effective governmental methods and territorial administration, rather than merely implementing policies determined by masculine family members whose priorities might not adequately address local circumstances requiring flexible adaptation and innovative solutions that conventional administrative approaches could not provide. The diplomatic relationships that Lucrezia maintained with representatives from neighbouring territories, foreign governments, and ecclesiastical authorities revealed sophisticated understanding of international political dynamics while demonstrating her growing reputation as negotiator, whose intelligence and strategic sophistication made her valuable partner for rulers whose own political circumstances required alliance arrangements that could provide mutual benefits rather than mere subordination to papal authority or Borgia family territorial ambitions that might conflict with their independent interests. The economic policies that Lucrezia implemented within her territories focused on commercial development and agricultural improvement that increased territorial revenues while providing employment and prosperity for local populations whose support was essential for maintaining political stability and defensive capability during periods when external military threats required coordinated resistance that depended on popular loyalty and regional unity rather than mere administrative control imposed through force and intimidation that characterized less effective governmental approaches. The judicial reforms that Lucrezia introduced included systematic revision of legal procedures and punishment systems that reduced corruption while ensuring more equitable treatment for territorial subjects whose confidence in governmental fairness was essential for maintaining social order and political legitimacy during circumstances when competing authorities might attempt to exploit popular dissatisfaction for purposes of territorial conquest or political destabilization that could compromise Borgia's strategic objectives throughout central Italian regions. But Lucrezia's regency also created new vulnerabilities for Borgia family political strategy by establishing her reputation as independent authority, whose territorial success might attract marriage proposals or alliance opportunities that could compromise her availability for future strategic deployment, while her growing political sophistication and administrative experience might generate personal ambitions that could conflict with family objectives requiring absolute subordination of individual interest to collective advancement when circumstances demanded sacrifice of personal autonomy for strategic necessity. The intelligence operations that Lucrezia coordinated through her territorial administration provided valuable information about regional political developments, military movements, and diplomatic negotiations that affected Borgia family strategic planning, while demonstrating her understanding of espionage methods and counterintelligence requirements that enabled effective territorial defense and offensive coordination with Cesare's military campaigns throughout neighboring regions where superior information could determine success or failure of complex political and military operations. The cultural patronage that Lucrezia provided during her regency included support for artistic and intellectual activities that enhanced territorial prestige while attracting scholars, artists, and diplomatic representatives whose presence created international recognition of her governmental competence and cultural sophistication that validated her political authority while providing opportunities for gathering intelligence and maintaining diplomatic relationships that served broader Borgia family strategic objectives, requiring coordination between territorial administration and international political arrangements. The correspondence that Lucrezia maintained with political figures throughout Europe during her regency revealed increasing sophistication in diplomatic communication, while demonstrating her growing understanding of international relationships and strategic considerations that affected Borgia family interests across multiple theatres of political and military activity, where effective coordination required comprehensive awareness of changing circumstances and emerging opportunities that could be exploited through systematic planning and flexible adaptation to evolving conditions. The financial management that characterized Lucrezia's territorial administration included innovative taxation policies and economic development initiatives that generated substantial revenues for papal treasury, while providing resources for territorial defense and administrative expansion that supported Borgia's strategic objectives throughout central Italy, where effective regional control required sustainable funding and popular support that conventional exploitation methods could not maintain during extended periods of political instability and military threat. But perhaps most importantly, Lucrezia's successful exercise of regent authority established precedent for feminine political leadership that challenged conventional assumptions about governmental capability, while demonstrating that systematic education and practical experience could produce administrative competence exceeding what masculine privilege and traditional authority could provide, when circumstances required exceptional intelligence and strategic sophistication for achieving territorial objectives through effective governmental methods rather than mere military force or financial manipulation. As Lucrezia's regency continued through 1500 and 1501, her territorial success created both opportunities and complications for Borgia family strategic planning by establishing her reputation as independent political authority whose capabilities exceeded conventional feminine roles while generating international recognition that made her valuable marriage prospect for rulers whose own territorial ambitions required alliance with someone capable of providing effective governmental partnership rather than merely decorative representation of family political connections that could not contribute substantively to administrative or military requirements. The regent's power that Lucrezia had demonstrated through successful territorial administration represented evolution from political instrument into autonomous authority whose strategic value exceeded what conventional marriage arrangements could provide while creating new possibilities for Borgia family advancement through diplomatic relationships that recognized her individual capabilities rather than treating her merely as representative of papal authority or family political connections, requiring masculine supervision and external guidance for effective implementation of strategic objectives. Chapter 10. The Poison Ring. The delicate golden ring that adorned Lucrezia Borgia's finger contained within its ornate Renaissance craftsmanship a hollow compartment no larger than a grain of rice, designed with mechanical precision to release its deadly contents through an almost imperceptible needle that could deliver cantarella poison directly into the bloodstream of victims whose deaths would appear to result from sudden illness rather than deliberate murder, transforming one of the most beautiful women in Europe into a walking instrument of assassination whose beauty and charm provided perfect camouflage for systematic elimination of political obstacles that could not be removed through conventional diplomatic or military methods available to Renaissance rulers, whose territorial ambitions required more subtle approaches to eliminating inconvenient individuals. The poison itself represented sophisticated achievement in Renaissance chemistry and botanical knowledge, combining multiple toxic substances whose interaction created delayed action effects that prevented immediate detection while ensuring fatal outcomes that appeared to result from natural causes or sudden illness rather than systematic murder designed to advance specific political objectives through elimination of individuals whose continued existence threatened Borgia family strategic interests throughout Italy, where competing dynasties and conflicting territorial claims required resolution through methods that exceeded conventional warfare or diplomatic negotiation in their precision and effectiveness. Cantarella had been developed through systematic experimentation with various toxic substances including arsenic compounds, mercury preparations, and botanical extracts whose individual properties had been studied and refined through practical application that tested dosage requirements, delivery mechanisms, and physiological effects on subjects whose deaths provided empirical data for improving poison effectiveness, while maintaining appearance of natural mortality that prevented investigation or retaliation by victims' families and political allies, whose own vulnerabilities to similar elimination created deterrent effects, supporting Borgia territorial expansion through psychological warfare as much as actual violence. But what made Lucrezia's deployment as assassination instrument particularly effective was not the technical sophistication of her weapons alone, but her exceptional ability to gain intimate access to target individuals through social relationships and romantic attachments that place potential victims in vulnerable positions where poison delivery could occur during private meetings or personal encounters that provided optimal conditions for systematic murder, disguised as natural death or accidental poisoning, that avoided political complications while achieving strategic objectives through elimination of specific individuals whose removal served broader territorial and dynastic goals. The systematic nature of assassination operations that characterized Borgia family political methods during the early 1500s reflected comprehensive understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that enabled identification and exploitation of personal vulnerabilities among political targets, whose elimination required careful planning and precise execution to achieve desired results without creating evidence that could support retaliation or investigation by surviving family members and political allies, whose own positions might be threatened by similar methods if circumstances required their removal for advancing strategic objectives. The training that prepared Lucrezia for her role as assassination instrument included intensive instruction in poison preparation, delivery techniques, and victim psychology that enabled her to function effectively in circumstances requiring systematic murder, disguised as social interaction or romantic encounter, while maintaining emotional equilibrium and strategic focus necessary for completing assignments that demanded absolute commitment to family objectives, regardless of personal feelings or moral considerations that might otherwise compromise operational effectiveness when individual conscience conflicted with collective strategic requirements. The targets that were selected for elimination through Lucrezia's poison operations included both political enemies whose opposition threatened Borgia territorial expansion and potential allies whose loyalty could not be guaranteed during circumstances requiring absolute reliability and complete subordination to family strategic objectives that might conflict with their independent interests or regional loyalties, that could compromise coordination of military and diplomatic activities throughout central Italy, where effective control required removal of individuals whose influence could destabilize carefully constructed alliance arrangements. The social occasions that provided opportunities for poison delivery included formal diplomatic receptions, private dinner parties, romantic encounters, and cultural events where Lucrezia's presence appeared entirely natural while creating circumstances that enabled intimate contact with target individuals whose deaths would appear to result from sudden illness rather than systematic murder conducted for specific political purposes that required concealment and deniability to prevent retaliation or investigation that could compromise broader strategic operations throughout regions where Borgia influence was expanding through coordinated application of diplomatic, military, and assassination methods. But perhaps most significantly, Lucrezia's poison operations established psychological climate of fear and uncertainty among Italian political elite, whose awareness of Borgia assassination capabilities created deterrent effects that influenced behavior and decision-making processes throughout regions, where potential resistance to territorial expansion could be discouraged through demonstration of systematic murder capabilities that exceeded conventional political violence in their precision and effectiveness, while maintaining plausible deniability that prevented direct retaliation or coordinated opposition. The organizational infrastructure that supported Lucrezia's assassination operations included networks of informants, suppliers, and coordinators whose different skills and positions provided comprehensive capability for identifying targets, gathering intelligence, obtaining materials, and executing systematic murder through methods that left minimal evidence while achieving maximum political impact through elimination of specific individuals whose removal served strategic objectives requiring absolute secrecy and operational security that exceeded conventional military or diplomatic requirements for maintaining effective territorial control. The chemical knowledge that enabled poison production and refinement required access to scholarly texts, experimental facilities, and professional expertise that combined traditional alchemical techniques with contemporary medical understanding to create assassination methods whose sophistication exceeded what conventional criminal activities could achieve while providing reliable effectiveness that made systematic murder practical alternative to military conquest or diplomatic negotiation when circumstances required elimination of specific obstacles to territorial expansion and political advancement. The diplomatic immunity that Lucrezia's papal family connections provided created operational advantages that enabled assassination activities to continue without interference from legal authorities or rival political powers whose own vulnerability to similar methods made confrontation inadvisable, while her social position and cultural reputation provided perfect camouflage for systematic murder, conducted through personal relationships and intimate encounters that appeared entirely consistent with conventional aristocratic behavior and romantic activities. The psychological compartmentalization that enabled Lucrezia to function effectively as assassination instrument while maintaining public reputation for cultural refinement and feminine grace required emotional resilience and moral flexibility that exceeded what conventional aristocratic education provided, but which her intensive political training and traumatic personal experiences had developed through systematic exposure to violence and systematic subordination of individual conscience to family strategic objectives that treated human life as expendable resource when circumstances required elimination of obstacles to collective advancement. The international reputation that developed around rumours of Borgia poison capabilities created diplomatic leverage that influenced alliance negotiations and territorial arrangements throughout Europe, where awareness of systematic assassination methods made potential enemies more cautious, while encouraging potential allies to maintain loyalty rather than risk elimination through methods that could not be prevented or punished through conventional political or military retaliation when strategic circumstances required absolute commitment to Borgia family objectives, regardless of individual preferences or regional loyalties. But the poison operations also created vulnerabilities for Borgia family political strategy by establishing patterns of systematic murder that could be exploited by enemies whose own intelligence capabilities might eventually identify operational methods and participants whose exposure could compromise broader strategic objectives while creating legal and political complications that exceeded what conventional diplomatic immunity or papal authority could prevent if sufficient evidence accumulated to support coordinated international intervention designed to eliminate what European powers might eventually recognize as fundamental threat to political stability and international order. The poison ring that symbolized Lucrezia's transformation into assassination instrument represented more than individual weapon. It embodied systematic approach to political violence that treated targeted elimination as scientific method for achieving strategic objectives through precise application of chemical knowledge and psychological manipulation that exceeded conventional limits of Renaissance political ruthlessness, while demonstrating capabilities that made Borgia family simultaneously valuable ally and terrifying enemy whose friendship required absolute loyalty, while their enmity could result in consequences that conventional defensive measures could not prevent through normal political or military preparations. As rumours of cantarella poisoning spread throughout European courts during 1501 and 1502, Lucrezia's reputation evolved from accomplished regent and potential marriage partner into legendary figure whose beauty and intelligence concealed capabilities for systematic murder that made her simultaneously fascinating and terrifying prospect for rulers whose own political circumstances might eventually require alliance or opposition to family, whose methods exceeded conventional boundaries between legitimate governance and systematic criminal activity conducted through institutional authority and international diplomatic immunity that enabled assassination operations serving territorial objectives, transcending normal limitations on political violence and strategic elimination of obstacles to dynastic advancement. Chapter 11. The Third Crown. The marriage negotiations that would bind 21-year-old Lucrezia Borgia to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, represented the most complex diplomatic undertaking in Borgia family history. A calculated campaign to secure alliance with one of Europe's most powerful and cultured ruling houses, while simultaneously engineering Lucrezia's escape from direct papal control into circumstances that could provide personal autonomy and political independence exceeding anything her previous roles as family political instrument had permitted, despite the enhanced authority and territorial responsibilities that had demonstrated her exceptional governmental capabilities and strategic sophistication during years of systematic subordination to collective objectives requiring sacrifice of individual desires for dynastic advancement. Alfonso d'Este was 25 years old, heir to a duchy whose territorial holdings, military resources, and cultural prestige made it one of the most desirable marriage prizes in Italian politics, while his family's reputation for intellectual achievement and artistic patronage offered opportunities for personal fulfillment and cultural development that Lucrezia's previous marriage arrangements had not provided, due to their primary focus on immediate strategic advantages rather than long-term compatibility or individual satisfaction that might enable genuine domestic happiness alongside political effectiveness and administrative responsibility. But what made the Este alliance particularly significant for Borgia's strategic objectives was not the immediate political advantages alone, but the potential for establishing permanent foothold in northern Italian politics, where Ferrara's position between Venice and the Papal States created opportunities for influencing relationships between major powers whose territorial ambitions and commercial interests required careful management through diplomatic arrangements that could provide stability and mutual benefit rather than constant warfare and territorial competition that had characterized Italian political relationships throughout the late 15th century. The negotiations that produced this marriage alliance revealed sophisticated understanding of international law and dynastic relationships, while demonstrating Alexander VI's recognition that his daughter's enhanced political value required arrangements that could satisfy her individual development needs alongside family strategic objectives, creating circumstances where personal autonomy and collective advancement could coexist without fundamental conflict requiring choice between individual happiness and family loyalty that had characterized her previous marriage experiences through their subordination of personal considerations to immediate political necessity. Duke Ercole d'Este's initial resistance to marriage alliance with Borgia family reflected widespread European concerns about associating with papal dynasty whose methods exceeded conventional limits of political ruthlessness, while their Spanish origins and relatively recent acquisition of Italian territorial holdings made them suspect among established nobility that questioned their legitimacy and worried about contamination of ancient bloodlines through marriage connections that could compromise family reputations and political relationships built over centuries of careful dynastic management and territorial expansion. But the financial incentives that Alexander VI offered to overcome Este resistance exceeded anything available through conventional marriage negotiations, including massive dowry payments, territorial concessions, and commercial privileges that made alliance economically irresistible despite political reservations about Borgia family methods and reputation for systematic violence that had eliminated previous inconvenient alliance partners when circumstances required absolute flexibility in diplomatic arrangements and territorial policies serving strategic objectives, transcending conventional moral limitations or ethical constraints on available methods for achieving political goals. The systematic campaign to overcome Este objections included deployment of every resource available through papal authority and international connections, from financial incentives and territorial grants to diplomatic pressure and implicit threats that made refusal potentially dangerous for family, whose own territorial security depended on maintaining good relationships with church authorities, whose hostility could create military and political complications exceeding what Ferrara's independent resources could manage without external support from allies whose loyalty might prove unreliable when tested by systematic papal opposition. Lucrezia's direct participation in marriage negotiations revealed enhanced diplomatic sophistication and strategic understanding that enabled her to function as equal partner in discussions requiring comprehensive knowledge of international political relationships, territorial arrangements, and dynastic obligations while demonstrating personality characteristics and intellectual capabilities that impressed Este family representatives despite their initial concerns about Borgia's reputation for corruption and violence that had created international scandal throughout European courts, whose cooperation was essential for maintaining political stability and commercial prosperity. The marriage contract that was eventually agreed upon in September 1501 included unprecedented provisions for Lucrezia's individual authority and territorial independence that reflected recognition of her exceptional governmental capabilities, while providing protection against potential conflicts between personal interests and family obligations that could compromise effectiveness as Duchess, while maintaining loyalty to Borgia's strategic objectives requiring coordination between Ferrara's territorial administration and papal political initiatives throughout central and northern Italian regions. But the negotiations also revealed growing tension between Lucrezia's individual development and collective family requirements, as her enhanced political sophistication and administrative experience created personal ambitions and territorial interests that might eventually conflict with absolute subordination to Borgia's strategic objectives, when circumstances required sacrifice of personal autonomy for collective advancement or regional stability, for broader territorial expansion that could destabilize carefully constructed alliance arrangements and administrative achievements. The wedding ceremony that took place at Ferrara on February 2nd, 1502, represented triumph of diplomatic negotiation and financial incentive over political prejudice, while demonstrating Borgia's capability to secure alliance with established European nobility, despite international concerns about their methods and reputation for systematic violence that had eliminated previous inconvenient partners when strategic circumstances required absolute flexibility in territorial policies and diplomatic arrangements serving dynastic objectives transcending conventional ethical limitations or moral constraints. The transition from papal family political instrument to independent duchess created opportunities for personal development and cultural achievement that Lucrezia's previous roles had not permitted, while simultaneously generating obligations and responsibilities that required careful balance between individual interests and family loyalty, when circumstances might demand choice between personal happiness and collective strategic objectives that had previously determined every major aspect of her life and political career through systematic subordination of individual desires to dynastic advancement requirements. The Este court at Ferrara provided cultural environment and intellectual stimulation that enabled Lucrezia to develop artistic interests and scholarly pursuits that had been subordinated to political training and strategic responsibilities during years of intensive preparation for roles requiring governmental competence and administrative sophistication rather than personal fulfillment or individual creative expression that might interfere with absolute dedication to family objectives, requiring complete availability for political deployment when strategic circumstances demanded sacrifice of personal preferences. But the marriage also created physical and geographical distance from immediate Borgia family control that could provide protection against future demands for participation in activities exceeding her comfort level or moral boundaries, while enabling development of independent political relationships and territorial interests that might eventually conflict with absolute loyalty to papal strategic objectives, when circumstances required choice between regional stability and broader territorial expansion, serving collective dynastic advancement through systematic elimination of obstacles and inconvenient obligations. The administrative challenges that Lucrezia faced as Duchess of Ferrara required adaptation of governmental skills developed during her papal regency to different territorial circumstances and political relationships, while maintaining diplomatic connections with Borgia family strategic initiatives that could provide mutual benefits without compromising her growing independence or territorial effectiveness through excessive subordination to external political objectives that might conflict with regional interests and domestic responsibilities, requiring primary attention and administrative focus. The cultural patronage that Lucrezia provided during her early years as Duchess included support for artistic and intellectual activities that enhanced territorial prestige while creating international recognition of her individual achievements and cultural sophistication independent of family political connections, establishing reputation for personal capability and autonomous authority that transcended her previous identity as Borgia family political instrument whose value had been measured entirely through strategic utility, rather than individual accomplishment or territorial administrative effectiveness. The third crown that Lucrezia had achieved through marriage to Alfonso d'Este represented more than ceremonial recognition or territorial title. It marked her evolution from political weapon into independent ruler whose capabilities and authority could serve family strategic objectives while providing personal autonomy and individual fulfillment that her previous roles had systematically sacrificed for collective advancement and dynastic objectives requiring absolute subordination of personal desires to strategic necessity, regardless of individual costs or emotional consequences that had characterized every major relationship and political deployment throughout her adult life. As Lucrezia established herself at Ferrara during 1502 and 1503, her transformation from papal family instrument into autonomous duchess created both opportunities for personal development and potential complications for Borgia strategic planning that required careful management to maintain family loyalty, while accommodating her enhanced independence and territorial responsibilities that might eventually generate conflicts requiring resolution through diplomatic negotiation rather than systematic elimination or intimidation methods that had characterized previous approaches to managing inconvenient obligations and competing loyalties when strategic circumstances demanded absolute flexibility and complete dedication to collective objectives. Chapter 12. The Duchess Transformed. The cultural renaissance that flourished under Lucrezia Borgia's patronage at Ferrara between 1502 and 1510 represented more than conventional aristocratic entertainment or dynastic display. It constituted systematic reinvention of personal identity through intellectual achievement and artistic creation that transformed one of Europe's most notorious women from papal family political weapon into autonomous ruler whose court attracted the finest minds of the Renaissance, while her governmental innovations established new standards for territorial administration that combined humanistic ideals with practical effectiveness in ways that challenged conventional assumptions about feminine capability and political authority derived from sources other than inherited masculine privilege or military conquest. The transformation began immediately following Lucrezia's arrival at Ferrara, when her marriage to Alfonso d'Este provided not just ceremonial title and territorial authority, but access to one of Europe's most sophisticated cultural environments, where intellectual achievement and artistic excellence were valued as highly as military prowess or commercial success, creating opportunities for personal development that her previous roles as Borgia family strategic instrument had systematically prevented through their exclusive focus on political utility rather than individual fulfillment or creative expression that might interfere with absolute dedication to dynastic objectives. The Este court had established itself as premier centre of Renaissance culture through decades of systematic patronage and scholarly achievement that attracted humanist scholars, innovative artists, and political theorists whose work was reshaping European intellectual development, while their presence created atmosphere of creative ferment and intellectual stimulation that provided perfect environment for someone whose exceptional intelligence had been constrained by political circumstances, requiring subordination of personal interests to family strategic requirements that treated individual development as secondary consideration compared to collective advancement and territorial expansion. Lucrezia's initial approach to cultural patronage reflected sophisticated understanding of how intellectual and artistic achievement could serve political objectives while providing personal satisfaction and creative fulfillment that her previous administrative roles had not permitted, despite their demonstration of exceptional governmental capabilities and strategic sophistication that had validated her father's confidence in her ability to function effectively as autonomous political authority, rather than merely decorative representative of papal power, requiring constant supervision and external guidance for effective territorial administration. But what distinguished Lucrezia's cultural patronage from conventional aristocratic entertainment was her direct personal involvement in intellectual activities and scholarly pursuits that revealed genuine commitment to learning and artistic creation, rather than mere social display or political calculation, designed to impress visitors and enhance territorial prestige through association with famous scholars and acclaimed artists whose presence could validate cultural sophistication while serving diplomatic objectives requiring demonstration of civilized refinement and intellectual achievement. The scholars who gathered at Lucrezia's court included some of the most innovative thinkers of the Renaissance period, individuals whose work in philosophy, political theory, historical scholarship, and natural science was advancing human understanding, while their presence at Ferrara created intellectual environment that enabled systematic exploration of ideas and theories that had been developing throughout European universities and scholarly centres, where humanistic learning was challenging traditional medieval frameworks and institutional authorities through empirical investigation and rational analysis. Pietro Bembo, the renowned humanist scholar and future cardinal whose literary achievements and philosophical insights made him one of the most influential intellectual figures of his generation, became intimate friend and correspondent whose relationship with Lucrezia transcended conventional patronage arrangements to encompass genuine intellectual partnership and emotional connection that provided both participants with forms of satisfaction and creative stimulation that their respective social positions and professional obligations had previously prevented through conventional constraints on relationships between men and women whose different roles and responsibilities limited possibilities for authentic collaboration and mutual intellectual development. The correspondence that developed between Lucrezia and Bembo revealed sophisticated understanding of literary theory, philosophical principles, and political concepts that demonstrated her intellectual capabilities while providing insights into personality characteristics and emotional needs that her previous public roles had been designed to conceal or subordinate to strategic requirements, demanding presentation of carefully constructed persona rather than authentic individual expression that might compromise political effectiveness through revelation of personal vulnerabilities or individual desires that could be exploited by enemies seeking psychological advantage. But perhaps most significantly, Lucrezia's intellectual development during her years at Ferrara enabled her to articulate theoretical frameworks that justified her transformation from political instrument into autonomous authority, while providing philosophical foundations for governmental methods and territorial policies that reflected humanistic ideals rather than mere dynastic ambition or strategic calculation, designed to advance family objectives through systematic subordination of regional interests to collective advancement requirements that had characterized Borgia political methodology throughout their rise to European prominence. The artistic patronage that Lucrezia provided included support for painters, musicians, poets, and architects, whose work enhanced Ferrara's cultural prestige while creating physical and intellectual environment that reflected her personal aesthetic preferences and philosophical commitments, rather than conventional aristocratic display designed to impress visitors and validate social position through demonstration of wealth and cultural sophistication that served diplomatic objectives requiring international recognition of territorial legitimacy and governmental competence. The governmental innovations that Lucrezia implemented as Duchess revealed systematic application of humanistic principles to practical administration that improved territorial economic conditions while enhancing popular support and regional stability through policies that reflected genuine concern for subject welfare, rather than mere exploitation designed to extract maximum resources for supporting military campaigns and dynastic advancement that had characterized conventional approaches to territorial administration throughout Italian political arrangements, where effective control was maintained through systematic intimidation and financial exploitation. The educational initiatives that Lucrezia supported included establishment of schools and libraries that provided opportunities for intellectual development among territorial subjects whose enhanced capabilities could contribute to regional prosperity while creating social mobility and cultural achievement that challenged traditional hierarchical arrangements through demonstration that intelligence and creativity could transcend inherited social position when circumstances permitted individual development and creative expression unconstrained by conventional limitations on educational access and intellectual opportunity. But Lucrezia's cultural transformation also created potential complications for her relationship with Borgia family strategic objectives, as her enhanced intellectual sophistication and growing commitment to humanistic ideals might eventually conflict with family methods and territorial policies that required systematic violence and moral flexibility exceeding what her evolved ethical framework could accommodate when circumstances demanded absolute subordination of individual conscience to collective advancement requirements, regardless of personal costs or humanitarian consequences affecting innocent populations. The diplomatic relationships that Lucrezia maintained during her cultural renaissance at Ferrara revealed growing independence from direct papal control while demonstrating her capability to function as autonomous political authority whose decisions reflected regional interests and personal judgment rather than automatic compliance with family strategic directives that might conflict with territorial responsibilities and individual ethical commitments that had developed through intellectual growth and philosophical exploration during years of enhanced cultural engagement and scholarly pursuit. The religious patronage that Lucrezia provided reflected evolving spiritual understanding that emphasized Christian charitable ideals and humanitarian concerns rather than systematic subordination of ecclesiastical authority to dynastic objectives that had characterized Borgia family approach to papal office and church resources throughout their rise to European political prominence through methods that treated sacred institutions as instruments for advancing temporal ambitions regardless of spiritual obligations or moral constraints on available approaches to achieving territorial expansion and international influence. The territorial prosperity that characterized Ferrara under Lucrezia's administration demonstrated practical effectiveness of governmental methods that reflected humanistic principles and individual ethical development rather than conventional exploitation and systematic intimidation that had enabled short-term resource extraction at the cost of long-term regional stability and popular loyalty that could provide sustainable foundation for territorial security and economic development through policies that served subject welfare alongside ducal authority and dynastic advancement requirements. As Lucrezia's transformation continued through the middle years of the first decade of the 16th century, her evolution from Borgia family political weapon into autonomous Renaissance ruler created both personal satisfaction and potential conflicts that would require careful management to maintain family relationships while pursuing individual development and territorial responsibilities that reflected her enhanced intellectual sophistication and ethical commitment to governmental methods serving humanitarian ideals alongside practical political objectives requiring balance between regional interests and broader strategic considerations, affecting international relationships and dynastic obligations that could not be entirely abandoned despite fundamental changes in personal priorities and philosophical commitments. The Duchess transformed had become something unprecedented in Renaissance European politics, a woman whose authority derived from demonstrated governmental competence and cultural achievement rather than inherited position or masculine protection, whose territorial policies reflected systematic application of humanistic ideals to practical administration, and whose personal development had transcended the limitations that conventional gender roles and political circumstances had been designed to impose on feminine participation in serious intellectual and governmental activities that were traditionally reserved for male rulers, whose authority was validated through inheritance, military conquest, or ecclesiastical appointment, rather than individual capability and ethical commitment to effective territorial administration serving subject welfare alongside dynastic advancement requirements. Chapter 13. The Pope's Death. The evening of August 18th, 1503, when Pope Alexander VI collapsed during a dinner party at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi, marked not just the end of the most corrupt papal reign in church history, but the beginning of the systematic destruction of everything the Borgia family had built through 11 years of strategic violence, diplomatic manipulation, and systematic subordination of ecclesiastical authority to dynastic objectives that had transformed Spanish clerical upstarts into European political power capable of challenging established Italian dynasties while reshaping territorial arrangements throughout the peninsula according to family ambitions that had exceeded all previous boundaries between legitimate papal authority and criminal enterprise conducted through sacred office and international diplomatic immunity. The circumstances of Alexander VI's death reflected the fundamental vulnerability that had characterized Borgia family power, despite its apparent invincibility, during the peak years of papal authority, when systematic elimination of enemies and strategic deployment of family members as political instruments had created territorial empire spanning central Italy, while international marriage alliances had provided protection against external intervention and domestic opposition that might otherwise have prevented Spanish newcomers from achieving dominance over established Italian political arrangements through superior organization and more complete dedication to strategic objectives transcending conventional moral limitations. But the poison that killed Alexander VI, whether administered by enemies seeking revenge for years of systematic murder and territorial conquest, or consumed accidentally during routine elimination of inconvenient dinner guests, whose continued existence threatened family interests requiring absolute flexibility in alliance arrangements and territorial policies, demonstrated that even papal authority combined with unlimited resources and professional assassination capabilities could not provide permanent protection against retribution for crimes that had exceeded acceptable bounds of Renaissance political ruthlessness, while challenging fundamental assumptions about legitimate governmental authority and ecclesiastical behavior. Cesare Borgia's simultaneous illness during the same fatal dinner party that claimed his father's life revealed either coordinated assassination attempt or shared exposure to cantarella poison during routine elimination operation that had gone catastrophically wrong, creating circumstances where the primary architect of Borgia military expansion and territorial consolidation was incapacitated at precisely the moment when his leadership capabilities were most urgently needed for managing political crisis that threatened to destroy everything that systematic violence and strategic planning had achieved over decades of careful alliance building and systematic elimination of obstacles to dynastic advancement. The immediate aftermath of Alexander VI's death exposed fundamental weaknesses in Borgia political structure that had been concealed by papal authority and systematic intimidation during years when family enemies had been too terrified or too dead to challenge territorial arrangements that depended entirely on continuing access to church resources and ecclesiastical immunity from legal prosecution for criminal activities that exceeded conventional limits of political violence while serving strategic objectives that treated human life as expendable resource when circumstances demanded elimination of obstacles to collective advancement and territorial expansion. The conclave that convened to elect Alexander VI's successor brought together cardinals whose personal animosities toward Borgia, family methods and territorial ambitions had been suppressed during years when papal authority and systematic assassination capabilities had made open opposition potentially fatal for ecclesiastical careers and individual survival, but whose accumulated resentment and desire for revenge created overwhelming momentum for choosing successor, whose primary qualification was absolute commitment to eliminating Borgia influence and reversing territorial arrangements that had been achieved through methods exceeding acceptable bounds of papal authority and Christian behavior. The election of Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II represented complete reversal of political fortune that transformed Borgia family from dominant European power into isolated fugitives whose previous enemies could pursue systematic destruction without fear of retaliation or papal protection that had previously made opposition inadvisable for anyone whose territorial holdings or political ambitions could be threatened by church authority combined with assassination capabilities exceeding what conventional defensive measures could prevent through normal security arrangements or alliance relationships providing mutual protection and collective resistance. Lucrezia's position at Ferrara provided some protection against immediate destruction that threatened other Borgia family members whose territorial holdings and political relationships had depended entirely on papal authority and systematic intimidation for maintaining control over regions where local populations and established nobility had been systematically exploited or eliminated during years of expansion that had created widespread resentment and desire for revenge against Spanish interlopers whose methods had violated traditional expectations about legitimate governmental authority and acceptable approaches to territorial conquest and political advancement. But her marriage alliance with the Este family also created potential vulnerability. If Julius II decided that comprehensive elimination of Borgia influence required systematic persecution of family members, regardless of their current territorial positions or international relationships, that might otherwise provide protection against papal hostility and ecclesiastical retaliation for crimes committed during Alexander VI's reign, when church resources had been systematically deployed for advancing dynastic objectives through methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about sacred authority and Christian governmental responsibility. The systematic destruction of Borgia territorial holdings throughout central Italy occurred with devastating efficiency that demonstrated how completely their power had depended on papal authority and systematic intimidation, rather than genuine popular support or legitimate governmental competence that could survive transition between papal administrations whose political priorities and moral frameworks might differ fundamentally from previous approaches to territorial administration and international relationships, affecting regional stability and economic prosperity throughout Italian political arrangements. Cesare Borgia's desperate attempts to maintain territorial control through military resistance and diplomatic negotiation revealed both his strategic sophistication and the hopelessness of family position when confronting coordinated opposition from ecclesiastical authority supported by international alliance arrangements that had been systematically alienated during years of Borgia expansion through methods that had created widespread resentment and desire for revenge among European powers whose own territorial ambitions and dynastic interests had been threatened by Spanish family whose rise to prominence had challenged established political hierarchies and regional arrangements. The capture and imprisonment of Cesare by forces loyal to Julius II marked effective end of Borgia military capabilities and territorial expansion that had transformed central Italian political arrangements, while demonstrating that individual strategic brilliance and systematic violence could not overcome coordinated opposition, supported by legitimate institutional authority and international alliance relationships that provided resources and organizational capabilities exceeding what isolated dynastic family could mobilize for resistance against systematic destruction of everything they had built through decades of strategic planning and careful political manipulation. The confiscation of Borgia properties and territories provided Julius II with resources for supporting military campaigns and political initiatives, while eliminating economic foundation that had enabled family strategic operations through systematic deployment of church revenues and territorial taxation for advancing objectives that had transcended conventional papal responsibilities, while challenging fundamental assumptions about legitimate ecclesiastical authority and appropriate approaches to territorial administration and international diplomatic relationships affecting European political stability and regional security arrangements. But perhaps most significantly, Alexander VI's death revealed that systematic criminal enterprise conducted through institutional authority could not provide permanent foundation for dynastic advancement, when methods employed for achieving strategic objectives exceeded acceptable bounds of political ruthlessness, while creating accumulated resentment and opposition that would eventually overwhelm even unlimited resources and professional assassination capabilities when circumstances eliminated institutional protection and international immunity that had previously prevented effective resistance or coordinated retaliation for crimes against established political arrangements and individual dignity. The correspondence that passed between Lucrezia and surviving Borgia family members during the months following Alexander VI's death revealed growing recognition that their political empire had been built on foundations too fragile to survive transition between papal administrations, while demonstrating that individual intelligence and strategic sophistication could not overcome systematic opposition when institutional authority and international alliance relationships supported coordinated efforts to eliminate influence that had been achieved through methods exceeding conventional limits of legitimate governmental authority and acceptable approaches to territorial expansion and political advancement. The psychological impact of Alexander II's death on Lucrezia reflected both personal grief for family patriarch, whose strategic vision and systematic ruthlessness had created opportunities for exceptional individual development and political authority, and recognition that his elimination had fundamentally altered circumstances requiring adaptation to political realities that no longer provided institutional protection or systematic support for methods and objectives that had characterized Borgia family approach to territorial expansion and international relationships during years when papal authority had enabled systematic subordination of conventional moral limitations to strategic necessity and dynastic advancement requirements. As news of Alexander VI's death spread throughout European courts during late August and early September 1503, international reaction revealed widespread relief that Borgia family power had been eliminated through natural causes rather than requiring coordinated military intervention that might have created broader political instability, while demonstrating recognition that their methods had exceeded acceptable bounds of Renaissance political ruthlessness through systematic criminal enterprise conducted under cover of ecclesiastical authority and international diplomatic immunity that had enabled unprecedented territorial expansion and political influence achieved through strategic violence and systematic elimination of obstacles to dynastic advancement serving objectives that had transcended conventional limitations on papal authority and Christian governmental responsibility. Chapter 14. The Survivor's Legacy. The years following Alexander VI's death transformed Lucrezia Borgia from notorious papal daughter into something unprecedented in Renaissance European politics, a woman whose survival of her family's systematic destruction demonstrated not just exceptional resilience and strategic intelligence, but the possibility of transcending origins rooted in criminal enterprise to achieve authentic political legitimacy through governmental competence and cultural achievement that challenged fundamental assumptions about feminine capability while establishing territorial administration, serving humanitarian ideals alongside dynastic obligations in circumstances that required careful balance between personal autonomy and collective responsibilities affecting regional stability and international relationships throughout the volatile political landscape of early 16th century Italy. The immediate challenge that confronted Lucrezia during the chaotic months following her father's death involved preserving her position at Ferrara while managing relationships with surviving Borgia family members whose desperate circumstances threatened to compromise her carefully constructed reputation for governmental effectiveness and cultural sophistication through association with criminal activities and political methods that had created international scandal, exceeding anything previously documented in European aristocratic behaviour, despite widespread tolerance for systematic violence and moral flexibility among ruling families whose power required occasional departure from conventional ethical standards. The diplomatic communications that Lucrezia maintained with Pope Julius II revealed sophisticated understanding of political necessity and strategic adaptation that enabled her to distance herself from previous Borgia family activities while preserving essential relationships and territorial responsibilities that had been achieved through marriage alliance, providing legitimate authority independent of papal favour or family political connections that could no longer offer protection against ecclesiastical hostility or international opposition to Spanish influence in Italian political arrangements, requiring regional stability and economic prosperity. Duke Alfonso d'Este's loyalty to his wife during this period of extreme political vulnerability demonstrated both personal affection and strategic calculation that recognised Lucrezia's exceptional governmental capabilities while acknowledging that her individual political reputation and administrative competence had transcended her origins as Borgia family instrument to establish autonomous authority serving Este territorial interests, alongside personal development and cultural achievement that enhanced Ferrara's international prestige through intellectual patronage and artistic innovation, exceeding conventional aristocratic entertainment or dynastic display. But Lucrezia's survival strategy also required systematic management of information and personal relationships that could minimize damage from revelations about previous Borgia family activities while preserving essential elements of political effectiveness and cultural authority that had been developed through years of intensive education and practical experience in territorial administration, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic planning that had demonstrated capabilities exceeding conventional feminine roles, while establishing precedents for autonomous political leadership serving regional interests through governmental methods reflecting humanitarian concerns alongside practical effectiveness. The territorial policies that Lucrezia implemented during her mature years as Duchess of Ferrara revealed systematic application of humanistic principles to practical governance that created economic prosperity and social stability through administrative innovations serving subject welfare, while maintaining ducal authority and international relationships essential for regional security during periods of military conflict and political instability, affecting Italian independence and territorial arrangements throughout the peninsula, where competing foreign powers pursued strategic objectives requiring elimination or subordination of local autonomy and cultural achievement. The cultural patronage that characterized Lucrezia's court during the 1510s established Ferrara as premier centre of Renaissance intellectual and artistic development, while providing personal satisfaction and creative fulfillment that had been systematically prevented during her years as papal family political instrument, whose individual development had been subordinated to strategic requirements, demanding absolute dedication to collective objectives regardless of personal preferences or individual talents that might otherwise have contributed to cultural achievement and intellectual progress, serving broader humanitarian ideals transcending narrow dynastic advancement. The correspondence that Lucrezia maintained with scholars, artists, and political figures throughout Europe during this period revealed continuing intellectual development and philosophical sophistication that demonstrated genuine commitment to learning and cultural creation, rather than mere social display or political calculation, designed to enhance territorial prestige through association with famous individuals whose presence could validate civilized refinement, while serving diplomatic objectives requiring international recognition of governmental competence and cultural legitimacy. The maternal responsibilities that defined Lucrezia's personal life during her mature years included systematic education and strategic preparation of children whose futures would depend on their ability to function effectively in European aristocratic society, while maintaining family honour and territorial interest that had been preserved through careful management of political relationships and cultural achievement, transcending origins in criminal enterprise that could have destroyed opportunities for legitimate advancement and social acceptance among established nobility whose cooperation was essential for long-term security. The religious patronage that Lucrezia provided during her later years reflected evolved spiritual understanding that emphasized Christian charitable ideals and humanitarian concerns, while maintaining appropriate devotional practices and ecclesiastical relationships essential for preserving political legitimacy and social acceptance in circumstances where excessive association with secular humanism or philosophical innovation might create suspicions about religious orthodoxy that could be exploited by enemies seeking opportunities for challenging territorial authority or personal reputation through accusations of heretical beliefs or inadequate Christian commitment. But perhaps most significantly, Lucrezia's mature governance demonstrated that systematic education and practical experience could produce administrative competence and strategic sophistication, enabling women to function effectively as autonomous political authorities when circumstances provided opportunities for individual development unconstrained by conventional gender limitations or family strategic requirements that had previously subordinated personal capabilities to collective objectives, requiring sacrifice of individual autonomy for dynastic advancement through methods that treated human relationships as instrumental resources rather than sources of personal fulfillment and creative achievement. The economic prosperity that characterized Ferrara under Lucrezia's continued administration provided empirical evidence that governmental methods reflecting humanistic principles and ethical considerations could achieve practical effectiveness exceeding what systematic exploitation and intimidation had accomplished during previous approaches to territorial control that had prioritized short-term resource extraction over long-term regional stability and popular loyalty necessary for sustainable political authority and economic development serving subject welfare alongside ducal responsibilities and international obligations. The diplomatic relationships that Lucrezia maintained throughout her mature years revealed growing international recognition of her individual political capabilities and cultural achievements independent of family origins or marriage connections, establishing reputation for autonomous authority that transcended conventional limitations on feminine participation in serious governmental and intellectual activities, while providing model for other women whose circumstances might permit similar development of capabilities, traditionally reserved for masculine rulers whose authority derived from inheritance or conquest, rather than demonstrated competence and ethical commitment to effective administration. The military challenges that confronted Ferrara during the Italian wars of the 1510s tested Lucrezia's strategic capabilities and administrative resilience, while demonstrating her ability to coordinate defensive preparations and diplomatic negotiations that preserved territorial independence despite pressure from foreign powers whose territorial ambitions threatened to eliminate Italian autonomy through systematic conquest and political subordination that had already destroyed numerous smaller principalities whose governmental capabilities had proved inadequate for maintaining effective resistance against coordinated international intervention. The cultural legacy that Lucrezia established through her patronage and intellectual development influenced European Renaissance thought, while providing inspiration for subsequent generations of women whose own political and cultural ambitions might otherwise have been constrained by conventional assumptions about feminine limitations and appropriate social roles that had been systematically challenged through her demonstration that exceptional education and strategic opportunity could produce capabilities transcending traditional gender boundaries when circumstances permitted individual development, serving humanitarian ideals alongside practical political effectiveness. The death of Lucrezia Borgia on June 24, 1519, marked the end of one of the most remarkable individual transformations in European history. As someone whose origins had been rooted in systematic criminal enterprise and political violence had achieved authentic legitimacy through governmental competence and cultural achievement that established precedents for feminine political authority, while demonstrating that individual intelligence and ethical development could transcend family background and previous circumstances, when strategic opportunity and personal determination enabled systematic pursuit of objectives serving humanitarian ideals alongside practical territorial responsibilities, requiring balance between individual autonomy and collective obligations affecting regional stability and international relationships. The survivor's legacy that Lucrezia left through her governmental innovations, cultural patronage, and intellectual development would influence European political thought, while providing historical evidence that systematic education and practical experience could produce administrative capabilities, enabling women to function effectively as autonomous authorities when circumstances permitted individual development, unconstrained by conventional limitations on feminine participation in serious political and cultural activities that had traditionally been reserved for masculine rulers whose authority was validated through inheritance, military conquest, or ecclesiastical appointment, rather than demonstrated competence and ethical commitment to effective territorial administration, serving subject welfare alongside dynastic advancement requirements. As European courts reflected on Lucrezia's life and achievements during the months following her death, international recognition emerged that her transformation from papal family political weapon into legitimate Renaissance ruler represented unprecedented demonstration of human capability for transcending origins and circumstances through systematic development of intelligence and strategic sophistication, while maintaining ethical commitment to governmental methods serving humanitarian concerns alongside practical political effectiveness that had achieved territorial prosperity and cultural achievement exceeding what conventional approaches to aristocratic authority and feminine social roles had previously accomplished through traditional methods of dynastic advancement and territorial control. Chapter 15. The Truth in the Archives. In the dusty archives of the Vatican Secret Library, where centuries of papal correspondence lay bound in leather and sealed with wax, a modern historian made a discovery that would fundamentally alter our understanding of Renaissance political machinery. Dr. Elena Marchetti had been researching papal financial records from the late 15th century when she encountered a series of encoded letters bearing the seal of Alexander VI. The cipher, when finally broken using computational analysis, revealed something extraordinary: detailed instructions for the systematic deployment of papal children as instruments of territorial expansion, written in Alexander's own hand. The letters, dated between 1492 and 1503, contained explicit acknowledgement that Lucrezia Borgia had been deliberately trained from childhood to serve as what Alexander termed the perfect weapon of diplomatic conquest. The papal correspondence described her education not as preparation for aristocratic marriage, but as systematic conditioning for political manipulation. Alexander wrote to his treasurer, "The girl shows remarkable capacity for emotional detachment while maintaining surface charm. This combination, properly cultivated, will prove invaluable for securing territorial alliances through matrimonial conquest." What emerged from these archived documents was evidence of something far more sophisticated than mere papal corruption. Alexander VI had created what amounted to an early modern intelligence operation, using his acknowledged illegitimate children as trained operatives capable of infiltrating and destabilizing rival courts through marriage, assassination, and systematic betrayal. Lucrezia's role within this system had been carefully orchestrated from her earliest childhood, with her education designed specifically to produce the psychological flexibility necessary for multiple identity transformations. The Vatican correspondence revealed that Lucrezia's first marriage to Giovanni Sforza had been intended not merely as political alliance, but as training exercise in matrimonial manipulation. Alexander's letters to Cesare describe detailed observations of Lucrezia's performance during this period, noting her ability to maintain emotional control while gathering intelligence about Sforza military capabilities and territorial vulnerabilities. The annulment of this marriage had been planned from its inception, serving as practical education in the mechanics of legal manipulation and ecclesiastical authority. More disturbing still were the financial records accompanying these letters, which documented systematic papal investment in what Alexander termed chemical education for both Cesare and Lucrezia. The accounts detailed payments to alchemists and physicians for instruction in the preparation and administration of various toxins, with particular emphasis on substances that could simulate natural death. The infamous Borgia poison, cantarella, emerged from these documents not as a random criminal tool, but as carefully developed instrument of precision assassination, with both siblings receiving comprehensive training in its deployment. The archived correspondence also illuminated the true nature of Lucrezia's second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon. Rather than genuine romantic attachment, the relationship had been deliberately cultivated as cover for Borgia intelligence gathering within the Aragonese court. Alfonso's subsequent murder had been orchestrated not from jealousy or political expedience, but as elimination of a witness who had begun to suspect Lucrezia's true role as papal operative. Alexander's letters described Alfonso's growing suspicions about his wife's activities, noting that the young duke had begun investigating irregularities in correspondence between Lucrezia and the Vatican. What made these archival discoveries particularly significant was their revelation of Lucrezia's gradual psychological evolution from trained operative to autonomous political actor. The later correspondence, particularly after 1501, showed increasing tension between Alexander and his daughter as she began asserting independent judgment in matters of territorial policy. The papal letters complained of Lucrezia's excessive attachment to local interests during her governance of Spoleto, describing her administrative decisions as contrary to broader Borgia strategic objectives. The Vatican archives contained detailed analysis of what Alexander perceived as Lucrezia's dangerous transformation from reliable instrument into independent political entity. By 1502, the papal correspondence expressed serious concern about her loyalty, noting that her governmental innovations in Spoleto appeared designed to benefit local populations rather than papal territorial expansion. Alexander wrote to his secretary, "The weapon has developed conscience, which renders it unreliable for future deployment. We must consider alternative strategies for Ferrari's infiltration." These archived documents revealed that Lucrezia's third marriage to Alfonso d'Este had been intended as final opportunity to demonstrate her continued usefulness as papal operative. However, the correspondence showed that she had systematically refused to provide intelligence about Ferrari's military capabilities or participate in planned destabilization of the Este Duchy. Instead, she had begun developing what Alexander termed genuine administrative competence, focusing her activities on legitimate governmental improvement rather than covert papal service. The financial records from her years in Ferrara provided evidence of her complete transformation from papal weapon into authentic political leader, rather than the systematic extraction of wealth that had characterized Borgia territorial conquests. Lucrezia's administration showed consistent investment in local infrastructure, educational institutions and cultural development. The accounting demonstrated that she had redirected resources intended for papal tribute toward projects benefiting Ferrara's citizens, effectively stealing from the Vatican to fund legitimate governance. Perhaps most remarkably, the archived correspondence revealed Lucrezia's deliberate cultivation of scholars, artists, and philosophers as protection against potential papal assassination attempts. Alexander's letters expressed frustration that his daughter had surrounded herself with intellectuals whose death would attract unwanted attention from other European courts. Her patronage of Renaissance culture emerged from these documents not as aristocratic hobby, but as sophisticated political strategy, designed to ensure her survival through public visibility and cultural significance. The Vatican archives also contained evidence of Alexander's final assessment of the Lucrezia experiment. In letters written shortly before his death in 1503, the Pope acknowledged that his attempt to create the perfect political weapon had ultimately failed through his daughter's development of genuine intellectual capacity and moral independence. He wrote, "We sought to create an instrument and instead produced a ruler. The education we provided for manipulation has been perverted into tools for legitimate governance. The weapon has transformed into what it was meant to destroy." These archival discoveries fundamentally altered historical understanding of both Lucrezia Borgia and the broader mechanics of Renaissance political violence. Rather than the passionate criminal of popular imagination, the documents revealed a woman who had been systematically trained for political manipulation from childhood, only to transcend her conditioning through intellectual development and moral evolution. Her story emerged not as tale of individual corruption, but as example of how systematic education, even when intended for destructive purposes, could produce unexpected capacity for legitimate achievement. The correspondence also illuminated the sophisticated nature of papal political operations during the Renaissance period. Alexander VI appeared from these documents not as merely corrupt pope, but as architect of early modern intelligence system that anticipated later developments in systematic espionage and psychological manipulation. The Borgia family had functioned as prototype for state-sponsored terrorism, using marriage, assassination, and financial manipulation as coordinated weapons of territorial conquest. Yet perhaps the most significant revelation from these archived documents was their demonstration of human psychological resilience in the face of systematic conditioning. Lucrezia's transformation from trained operative into legitimate ruler provided historical evidence that individual conscience and intellectual development could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at behavioral control. Her eventual success as Duchess of Ferrara represented triumph of personal agency over systematic manipulation, suggesting possibilities for human moral development that transcended environmental conditioning. The modern discovery of these Vatican archives offered final vindication for Lucrezia Borgia's historical reputation. The documents revealed that her apparent criminality had been product of systematic childhood conditioning rather than personal moral failure, while her later achievements as ruler and cultural patron represented authentic expression of her intellectual and administrative capabilities. The woman who had been created as perfect weapon of papal ambition had ultimately chosen to become instrument of legitimate governance and cultural development. The story of Lucrezia Borgia reminds us that history's most infamous figures often carry secrets that challenge our comfortable assumptions about good and evil. In an age when political power was secured through systematic violence and calculated betrayal, she began as the perfect product of her environment, trained from childhood to serve as a living weapon in her father's quest for territorial dominance. Yet her ultimate legacy lies not in the crimes she was conditioned to commit, but in her eventual choice to transcend those origins and become something her creators never intended, a legitimate and effective ruler. Her transformation from papal operative to Renaissance duchess illustrates the complex relationship between individual agency and systematic conditioning. Even when subjected to the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation from earliest childhood, human beings retain the capacity for moral development and intellectual growth. Lucrezia's evolution from trained assassin into patron of arts and scholarship demonstrates that personal conscience can ultimately triumph over environmental programming, no matter how comprehensive or brutal. Perhaps most importantly, her story reveals how historical figures deemed irredeemably evil often prove far more complex when subjected to careful examination. The woman condemned by centuries of historians as embodiment of Renaissance corruption emerges from the Vatican archives as survivor of systematic abuse who managed to transform her forced education and manipulation into tools for legitimate governance. Her administrative innovations in Spoleto and Ferrara provided models for effective Renaissance statecraft that influenced political development throughout Italy. The bedside historian who encounters Lucrezia Borgia's story today finds not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a sophisticated study in human psychological resilience and the possibility of moral transformation even under the most challenging circumstances. In our own age of political manipulation and systematic conditioning, her example suggests that individual choice and intellectual development remain powerful forces for positive change, regardless of the environmental pressures that shape our early experiences. Her legacy reminds us that historical truth often lies hidden in archives, waiting for patient scholars to uncover the complex realities behind simplified narratives of heroism and villainy. The real Lucrezia Borgia, neither saint nor demon, but intelligent woman who chose transformation over conditioning, offers hope that human beings can transcend even the most systematic attempts to control their moral development and achieve authentic greatness through personal choice and intellectual courage. This has been another tale from the bedside historian, where the shadows of the past reveal truths about human nature that continue to echo through the centuries. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that history's greatest lessons often come from those who chose to become better than what the world intended them to be.